A daughter is born. When I was born, people in our village commiserated with my mother and nobody congratulated my father. I arrived at dawn as the last star blinked out. We Pashtuns see this as an auspicious sign. My father didn't have any money for the hospital or for a midwife, so a neighbor helped at my birth. My parents' first child was stillborn, but I popped out kicking and screaming. I was a girl in a land where rifles are fired in celebration of a son, while daughters are hidden away behind a curtain, their role in life simply to prepare food and give birth to children. For most Pashtuns it's a gloomy day when a daughter is born. My father's cousin Jehan Sher Khan Yusufzai was one of the few who came to celebrate my birth and even gave a handsome gift of money. Yet, he brought with him a vast family tree of our clan, the Dalikhel Yusufzai, going right back to my great-great-grandfather and showing only the male line. My father, Zirdan, is different from most Pashtun men. He took the tree, drew a line like a lollipop from his name, and at the end of it he wrote, Malala. His cousin laughed in astonishment. My father didn't care. He says he looked into my eyes after I was born and fell in love. He told people, I know there is something different about this child. He even asked friends to throw dried fruits, sweets and coins into my cradle, something we usually only do for boys. I was named after Malala of Maiwand, the greatest heroine of Afghanistan. Pashtuns are a proud people of many tribes split between Pakistan and Afghanistan. We live as we have for centuries by a code called Pashtunwali, which obliges us to give hospitality to all guests and in which the most important value is nang or honor. The worst thing that can happen to a Pashtun is loss of face. Shame is a very terrible thing for a Pashtun man. We have a saying, without honor, the world counts for nothing. We fight and feud among ourselves so much that our word for cousin, Taba, is the same as our word for enemy. But we always come together against outsiders who try to conquer our lands. All Pashtun children grow up with the story of how Malala inspired the Afghan army to defeat the British in 1880 in one of the biggest battles of the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Malala was the daughter of a shepherd in Maiwand, a small town on the dusty plains west of Kandahar. When she was a teenager, both her father and the man she was supposed to marry were among thousands of Afghans fighting against the British occupation of the country. Malala went to the battlefield with other women from the village to tend the wounded and take them water. She saw their men were losing, and when the flag bearer fell she lifted her white veil up high and marched onto the battlefield in front of the troops. Young love, she shouted, if you do not fall in the battle of Maiwand, then, by God, someone is saving you as a symbol of shame. Malala was killed under fire, but her words and bravery inspired the men to turn the battle around. They destroyed an entire brigade, one of the worst defeats in the history of the British Army. The Afghans were so proud that the last Afghan king built a Maiwand victory monument in the center of Kabul. In high school I read some Sherlock Holmes and laughed to see that this was the same battle where Dr. Watson was wounded before becoming partner to the great detective. In Malala we Pashtuns have our very own Joan of Arc. Many girls' schools in Afghanistan are named after her. But my grandfather, who was a religious scholar and village cleric, didn't like my father giving me that name. It's a sad name, he said. It means grief-stricken. When I was a baby my father used to sing me a song written by the famous poet Rahmat Shah Sahil of Peshawar. The last verse ends, O Malala of Maiwand, rise once more to make Pashtuns understand the song of honor, your poetic words turn worlds around. I beg you, rise again. My father told the story of Malala to anyone who came to our house. I loved hearing the story and the songs my father sang to me, and the way my name floated on the wind when people called it. We lived in the most beautiful place in all the world. My valley, the Swat Valley, is a heavenly kingdom of mountains, gushing waterfalls and crystal clear lakes. Welcome to paradise, it says on a sign as you enter the valley. In olden times Swat was called Udhyana, which means garden. We have fields of wild flowers, orchards of delicious fruit, emerald mines and rivers full of trout. People often call Swat the Switzerland of the East. We even had Pakistan's first ski resort. The rich people of Pakistan came on holiday to enjoy our clean air and scenery and our Sufi festivals of music and dancing. And so did many foreigners, all of whom we called Angresan, English, wherever they came from. Even the Queen of England came, and stayed in the White Palace that was built from the same marble as the Taj Mahal by our king, the first Wali of Swat. We have a special history too. Today Swat is part of the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or KPK, as many Pakistanis call it, but Swat used to be separate from the rest of Pakistan. We were once a princely state, one of three with the neighbouring lands of Chitral and Dir. In colonial times our kings owed allegiance to the British but ruled their own land. When the British gave India independence in 1947 and divided it, we went with the newly created Pakistan but stayed autonomous. We used the Pakistani rupee, but the government of Pakistan could only intervene on foreign policy. The Wali administered justice, kept the peace between warring tribes and collected ushur, a tax of 10% of income, with which he built roads, hospitals and schools. We were only 100 miles from Pakistan's capital Islamabad as the crow flies, but it felt as if it was in another country. The journey took at least 5 hours by road over the MALALA Pass, a vast bowl of mountains where long ago our ancestors, led by a preacher called Mullah Saidullah, known by the British as the Mad Fakir, battled British forces among the craggy peaks. Among them was Winston Churchill, who wrote a book about it, and we still call one of the peaks Churchill's Picket, even though he was not very complimentary about our people. At the end of the pass is a green domed shrine where people throw coins to give thanks for the safe arrival. No one I knew had been to Islamabad. Before the troubles came, most people, like my mother, had never been outside Swat. We lived in Mingora, the biggest town in the valley, in fact the only city. It used to be a small place, but many people had moved in from surrounding villages, making it dirty and crowded. It has hotels, colleges, a golf course and a famous bazaar for buying art, traditional embroidery, gemstones and anything you can think of. The Margaza stream loops through it, milky brown from the plastic bags and rubbish thrown into it. It is not clear like the streams in the hilly areas or like the wide river Swat just outside town, where people fished for trout and which we visited on holidays. Our house was in Gulkada, which means place of flowers, but it used to be called Butkara, or place of the Buddhist statues. Near our home was a field scattered with mysterious ruins, statues of lions on their haunches, broken columns, headless figures and, oddest of all, hundreds of stone umbrellas. Islam came to our valley in the 11th century when Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni invaded from Afghanistan and became our ruler, but in ancient times Swat was a Buddhist kingdom. The Buddhists had arrived here in the 2nd century and the kings ruled the valley for more than 500 years. Chinese explorers wrote stories of how there were 1,400 Buddhist monasteries along the banks of the river Swat, and the magical sound of temple bells would ring out across the valley. The temples are long gone, but almost anywhere you go in Swat, amid all the primroses and other wild flowers, you find their remains. We would often picnic among rock carvings of a smiling fat Buddha sitting cross-legged on a lotus flower. There are many stories that Lord Buddha himself came here because it is a place of such peace, and some of his ashes are said to be buried in the valley in a giant stupa. Our Butkara ruins were a magical place to play hide and seek. Once some foreign archaeologists arrived to do some work there and told us that in times gone by it was a place of pilgrimage, full of beautiful temples domed with gold where Buddhist kings lay buried. My father wrote a poem, The Relics of Butkara, which summed up perfectly how temple and mosque could exist side by side. When the voice of truth rises from the minaret, the Buddha smiles, and the broken chain of history reconnects. We lived in the shadow of the Hindu Kush mountains, where the men went to shoot ibex and golden cockerels. Our house was one story and proper concrete. On the left were steps up to a flat roof big enough for us children to play cricket on. It was our playground. At dusk my father and his friends often gathered to sit and drink tea there. Sometimes I Saturday on the roof too, watching the smoke rise from the cooking fires all around and listening to the nightly racket of the crickets. Our valley is full of fruit trees on which grow the sweetest figs and pomegranates and peaches, and in our garden we had grapes, guavas and persimmons. There was a plum tree in our front yard which gave the most delicious fruit. It was always a race between us and the birds to get to them. The birds loved that tree. Even the woodpeckers. For as long as I can remember my mother has talked to birds. At the back of the house was a veranda where the women gathered. We knew what it was like to be hungry, so my mother always cooked extra and gave food to poor families. If there was any left she fed it to the birds. In Pashtu we loved to sing tapi, 2-line poems, and as she scattered the rice she would sing one, don't kill doves in the garden. You kill one and the others won't come. I like to sit on the roof and watch the mountains and dream. The highest mountain of all is the pyramid-shaped Mount Elam. To us it's a sacred mountain and so high that it always wears a necklace of fleecy clouds. Even in summer it's frosted with snow. At school we learned that in 327 BC, even before the Buddhists came to Swat, Alexander the Great swept into the valley with thousands of elephants and soldiers on his way from Afghanistan to the Indus. The Swati people fled up the mountain, believing they would be protected by the gods because it was so high. But Alexander was a determined and patient leader. He built a wooden ramp from which his catapults and arrows could reach the top of the mountain. Then he climbed up so he could catch hold of the star of Jupiter as a symbol of his power. From the rooftop I watched the mountains change with the seasons. In the autumn chill winds would come. In the winter everything was white snow, long icicles hanging from the roof like daggers, which we loved to snap off. We raced around, building snowmen and snow bears and trying to catch snowflakes. Spring was when Swat was at its greenest. Eucalyptus blossom blew into the house, coating everything white, and the wind carried the pungent smell of the rice fields. I was born in summer, which was perhaps why it was my favorite time of year, even though in Mingora summer was hot and dry and the stream stank where people dumped the garbage. When I was born we were very poor. My father and a friend had founded the first school and we lived in a shabby shack of 2 rooms opposite the school. I slept with my mother and father in one room and the other was for guests. We had no bathroom or kitchen, and my mother cooked on a wood fire on the ground and washed our clothes at a tap in the school. Our home was always full of people visiting from the village. Hospitality is an important part of Pashtun culture. 2 years after I was born my brother Kushal arrived. Like me he was born at home as we still could not afford the hospital, and he was named Kushal like my father's school, after the Pashtun hero Kushal Khan Khattak, a warrior who was also a poet. My mother had been waiting for a son and could not hide her joy when he was born. To me he seemed very thin and small, like a reed that could snap in the wind, but he was the apple of her eye, her ladla. It seemed to me that his every wish was her command. He wanted tea all the time, our traditional tea with milk and sugar and cardamom, but even my mother tired of this and eventually made some so bitter that he lost the taste for it. She wanted to buy a new cradle for him. When I was born my father couldn't afford one so they used an old wooden one from the neighbors which was already 3rd or 4th hand, but my father refused. Malala swung in that cradle, he said. So can he. Then, nearly 5 years later, another boy was born, Atul, bright-eyed and inquisitive like a squirrel. After that, said my father, we were complete. 3 children is a small family by Swati standards, where most people have 7 or 8. I played mostly with Kushal because he was just 2 years younger than me, but we fought all the time. He would go crying to my mother and I would go to my father. What's wrong, Yani? He would ask. Like him I was born double-jointed and can bend my fingers right back on themselves. And my ankles click when I walk, which makes adults squirm. My mother is very beautiful and my father adored her as if she were a fragile china vase, never laying a hand on her, unlike many of our men. Her name Torpekai means, raven tresses, even though her hair is chestnut brown. My grandfather, Jamsa Khan, had been listening to Radio Afghanistan just before she was born and heard the name. I wished I had her white lily skin, fine features and green eyes, but instead had inherited the sallow complexion, white nose and brown eyes of my father. In our culture we all have nicknames, aside from Pasho, which my mother had called me since I was a baby. Some of my cousins called me Lachi, which is Pashtu for cardamom. Black-skinned people are often called white and short people tall. We have a funny sense of humor. My father was known in the family as Karasta Dada, which means beautiful. When I was around 4 years old I asked my father, Abba, what color are you? He replied, I don't know, a bit white, a bit black. It's like when one mixes milk with tea, I said. He laughed a lot, but as a boy he had been so self-conscious about being dark-skinned that he went to the fields to get buffalo milk to spread on his face, thinking it would make him lighter. It was only when he met my mother that he became comfortable in his own skin. Being loved by such a beautiful girl gave him confidence. In our society marriages are usually arranged by families, but theirs was a love match. I could listen endlessly to the story of how they met. They came from neighboring villages in a remote valley in the upper Swat called Shangla and would see each other when my father went to his uncle's house to study, which was next door to that of my mother's aunt. They glimpsed enough of each other to know they liked one another, but for us it is taboo to express such things. Instead he sent her poems she could not read. I admired his mind, she says. And me, her beauty, he laughs. There was one big problem. My two grandfathers did not get on. So when my father announced his desire to ask for the hand of my mother, Torpekai, it was clear neither side would welcome the marriage. His own father said it was up to him and agreed to send a barber as a messenger, which is the traditional way we Pashtuns do this. Malik Jamsa Khan refused the proposal, but my father is a stubborn man and persuaded my grandfather to send the barber again. Jamsa Khan's hujra was a gathering place for people to talk politics, and my father was often there, so they had got to know each other. He made him wait 9 months but finally agreed. My mother comes from a family of strong women as well as influential men. Her grandmother, my great-grandmother, was widowed when her children were young, and her eldest son Jamsa Khan was locked up because of a tribal feud with another family when he was only 9. To get him released she walked 40 miles alone over mountains to appeal to a powerful cousin. I think my mother would do the same for us. Though she cannot read or write, my father shares everything with her, telling her about his day, the good and the bad. She teases him a lot and gives him advice about who she thinks is a genuine friend and who is not, and my father says she is always right. Most Pashtun men never do this, as sharing problems with women is seen as weak. He even asks his wife. They say as an insult. I see my parents happy and laughing a lot. People would see us and say we are a sweet family. My mother is very pious and prays 5 times a day, though not in the mosque as that is only for the men. She disapproves of dancing because she says God would not like it, but she loves to decorate herself with pretty things, embroidered clothes and golden necklaces and bangles. I think I am a bit of a disappointment to her as I am so like my father and don't bother with clothes and jewels. I get bored going to the bazaar but I love to dance behind closed doors with my school friends. Growing up, we children spent most of our time with our mother. My father was out a lot as he was busy, not just with his school, but also with literary societies and jiggers, as well as trying to save the environment, trying to save our valley. My father came from a backward village yet through education and force of personality he made a good living for us and a name for himself. People liked to hear him talk, and I loved the evenings when guests visited. We would sit on the floor around a long plastic sheet which my mother laid with food, and eat with our right hand as is our custom, balling together rice and meat. As darkness fell we Saturday by the light of oil lamps, batting away the flies as our silhouettes made dancing shadows on the walls. In the summer months there would often be thunder and lightning crashing outside and I would crawl closer to my father's knee. I would listen rapt as he told stories of warring tribes, Pashtun leaders and saints, often through poems that he read in a melodious voice, crying sometimes as he read. Like most people in Swat we are from the Yusufzai tribe. We Yusufzai, which some people spell Yusufzai or Yusufzai, are originally from Kandahar and are one of the biggest Pashtun tribes, spread across Pakistan and Afghanistan. Our ancestors came to Swat in the 16th century from Kabul, where they had helped a Timurid Emperor win back his throne after his own tribe removed him. The emperor rewarded him with important positions in the court and army, but his friends and relatives warned him that the Yusufzai were becoming so powerful they would overthrow him. So one night he invited all the chiefs to a banquet and set his men on them while they were eating. Around 600 chiefs were massacred. Only 2 escaped, and they fled to Peshawar along with the tribesmen. After some time they went to visit some tribes in Swat to win their support so they could return to Afghanistan. But they were so captivated by the beauty of Swat they instead decided to stay there and force the other tribes out. The Yusufzai divided up all the land among the male members of the tribe. It was a peculiar system called Wesh under which every 5 or 10 years all the families would swap villages and redistribute the land of the new village among the men so that everyone had the chance to work on good as well as bad land. It was thought this would then keep rival clans from fighting. Villages were ruled by khans, and the common people, craftsmen and laborers, were the tenants. They had to pay them rent in kind, usually a share of the crop. They also had to help the khans form a militia by providing an armed man for every small plot of land. Each khan kept hundreds of armed men both for feuds and to raid and loot other villages. As the Yusufzai in Swat had no ruler, there were constant feuds between the khans and even within their own families. Our men all have rifles, though these days they don't walk around with them like they do in other Pashtun areas, and my great-grandfather used to tell stories of gun battles when he was a boy. In the early part of the last century they became worried about being taken over by the British, who by then controlled most of the surrounding lands. They were also tired of the endless bloodshed. So they decided to try and find an impartial man to rule the whole area and resolve the disputes. After a couple of rulers who did not work out, in 1917 the chiefs settled on a man called Myangal Abdul Wadud as the king. We know him affectionately as Badshah Sahib, and though he was completely illiterate, he managed to bring peace to the valley. Taking a rifle away from a Pashtun is like taking away his life, so he could not disarm the tribes. Instead he built forts on mountains all across Swat and created an army. He was recognized by the British as the head of state in 1926 and installed as wali, which is our word for ruler. He set up the first telephone system and built the first primary school and ended the Wesh system because the constant moving between villages meant no one could sell land or had any incentive to build better houses or plant fruit trees. In 1949, 2 years after the creation of Pakistan, he abdicated in favor of his elder son Myangal Abdul Haq Jahanzeb. My father always says, while Badshah Sahib brought peace, his son brought prosperity. We think of Jahanzeb's reign as a golden period in our history. He had studied in a British school in Peshawar, and perhaps because his own father was illiterate he was passionate about schools and built many, as well as hospitals and roads. In the 1950s he ended the system where people paid taxes to the Khans. But there was no freedom of expression, and if anyone criticized the wali, they could be expelled from the valley. In 1969, the year my father was born, the wali gave up power and we became part of Pakistan's northwest frontier province, which a few years ago changed its name to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So I was born a proud daughter of Pakistan, though like all Swatis I thought of myself first as Swati and then Pashtun, before Pakistani. Near us on our street there was a family with a girl my age called Safina and 2 boys similar in age to my brothers, Babar and Basit. We all played cricket on the street or rooftops together, but I knew. As we got older the girls would be expected to stay inside. We'd be expected to cook and serve our brothers and fathers. While boys and men could roam freely about town, my mother and I could not go out without a male relative to accompany us, even if it was a 5-year-old boy. This was the tradition. I had decided very early I would not be like that. My father always said, Malala will be free as a bird. I dreamed of going to the top of Mount Elam like Alexander the Great to touch Jupiter and even beyond the valley. But, as I watched my brothers running across the roof, flying the kites and skillfully flicking the strings back and forth to cut each other's down, I wondered how free a daughter could ever be. My Father the Falcon. I always knew my father had trouble with words. Sometimes they would get stuck and he would repeat the same syllable over and over like a record caught in a groove as we all waited for the next syllable to suddenly pop out. He said it felt like a wall came down in his throat. M's, P's and K's were all enemies lying in wait. I teased him that one of the reasons he called me Yani was because he found it easier to say than Malala. A stutter was a terrible thing for a man who so loved words and poetry. On each side of the family he had an uncle with the same affliction. But it was almost certainly made worse by his father, whose own voice was a soaring instrument that could make words thunder and dance. Spit it out, son. He'd roar whenever my father got stuck in the middle of a sentence. My grandfather's name was Roel Amin, which means honest spirit, and is the holy name of the angel Gabriel. He was so proud of the name that he would introduce himself to people with a famous verse in which his name appears. He was an impatient man at the best of times and would fly into a rage over the smallest thing, like a hen going astray or a cup getting broken. His face would redden and he would throw kettles and pots around. I never knew my grandmother, but my father says she used to joke with my grandfather, by God, just as you greet us only with a frown, when I die may God give you a wife who never smiles. My grandmother was so worried about my father's stutter that when he was still a young boy she took him to see a holy man. It was a long journey by bus, then an hour's walk up the hill to where he lived. Her nephew Fazli Hakim had to carry my father on his shoulders. The holy man was called LIbAN, Saint of the Mad, because he was said to be able to calm lunatics. When they were taken in to see the pier, he instructed my father to open his mouth and then spat into it. Then he took some gur, dark molasses made from sugar cane, and rolled it around his mouth to moisten it with spit. He then took out the lump and presented it to my grandmother to give to my father, a little each day. The treatment did not cure the stutter. Actually, some people thought it got worse. So when my father was 13 and told my grandfather he was entering a public speaking competition, he was stunned. "How can you?" Roel Amin asked, laughing. "You take 1 or 2 minutes to utter just one sentence." "Don't worry," replied my father. "You write the speech and I will learn it." My grandfather was famous for his speeches. He taught theology in the government high school in the village of Shahpur. He was also an imam at the local mosque. He was a mesmerizing speaker. His sermons at Friday prayers were so popular that people would come down from the mountains by donkey or on foot to hear him. My father comes from a large family. He had one much older brother, Saeed Ramzan, who I call Uncle Khan Dada, and 5 sisters. Their village of Barkana was very primitive and they lived crammed together in a 1-story ramshackle house with a mud roof which leaked whenever it rained or snowed. As in most families, the girls stayed at home while the boys went to school. They were just waiting to be married, says my father. School wasn't the only thing my aunts missed out on. In the morning when my father was given cream or milk, his sisters were given tea with no milk. If there were eggs, they would only be for the boys. When a chicken was slaughtered for dinner, the girls would get the wings and the neck while the luscious breast meat was enjoyed by my father, his brother and my grandfather. From early on I could feel I was different from my sisters, my father says. There was little to do in my father's village. It was too narrow even for a cricket pitch and only one family had a television. On Fridays the brothers would creep into the mosque and watch in wonder as my grandfather stood in the pulpit and preached to the congregation for an hour or so, waiting for the moment when his voice would rise and practically shake the rafters. My grandfather had studied in India, where he had seen great speakers and leaders including Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, our great Pashtun leader who campaigned for independence. Baba, as I called him, had even witnessed the moment of freedom from the British colonialists at midnight on the 14th of August 1947. He had an old radio set my uncle still has, on which he loved to listen to the news. His sermons were often illustrated by world events or historical happenings as well as stories from the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. He also liked to talk about politics. Swat became part of Pakistan in 1969, the year my father was born. Many Swatis were unhappy about this, complaining about the Pakistani justice system, which they said was much slower and less effective than their old tribal ways. My grandfather would rail against the class system, the continuing power of the Khans and the gap between the haves and have-nots. My country may not be very old but unfortunately it already has a history of military coups, and when my father was 8 a general called Zia-ul-Haq seized power. There are still many pictures of him around. He was a scary man with dark panda shadows around his eyes, large teeth that seemed to stand to attention and hair pomaded flat on his head. He arrested our elected Prime Minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and had him tried for treason then hanged from a scaffold in Rawalpindi jail. Even today people talk of Mr. Bhutto as a man of great charisma. They say he was the first Pakistani leader to stand up for the common people, though he himself was a feudal lord with vast estates of mango fields. His execution shocked everybody and made Pakistan look bad all around the world. The Americans cut off aid. To try to get people at home to support him, General Zia launched a campaign of Islamization to make us a proper Muslim country with the army as the defenders of our country's ideological as well as geographical frontiers. He told our people it was the duty to obey his government because it was pursuing Islamic principles. Zia even wanted to dictate how we should pray, and set up salat or prayer committees in every district, even in our remote village, and appointed 100,000 prayer inspectors. Before then mullahs had almost been figures of fun. My father said at wedding parties they would just hang around in a corner and leave early, but under Zia they became influential and were called to Islamabad for guidance on sermons. Even my grandfather went. Under Zia's regime, life for women in Pakistan became much more restricted. Jinnah said, "No struggle can ever succeed without women participating side by side with men. There are two powers in the world. One is the sword and the other is the pen. There is a third power stronger than both, that of women." But General Zia brought in Islamic laws which reduced a woman's evidence in court to count for only half that of a man's. Soon our prisons were full of cases like that of a 13-year-old girl who was raped and become pregnant and was then sent to prison for adultery because she couldn't produce 4 male witnesses to prove it was a crime. A woman couldn't even open a bank account without a man's permission. As a nation we have always been good at hockey, but Zia made our female hockey players wear baggy trousers instead of shorts, and stopped women playing some sports altogether. Many of our madrasas or religious schools were opened at that time, and in all schools religious studies, what we call diniyat, was replaced by ilamiyat, or Islamic studies, which children in Pakistan still have to do today. Our history textbooks were rewritten to describe Pakistan as a fortress of Islam, which made it seem as if we had existed far longer than since 1947, and denounced Hindus and Jews. Anyone reading them might think we won the 3 wars we have fought and lost against our great enemy India. Everything changed when my father was 10. Just after Christmas 1979 the Russians invaded our neighbor Afghanistan. Millions of Afghans fled across the border and General Zia gave them refuge. Vast camps of white tents sprang up mostly around Peshawar, some of which are still there today. Our biggest intelligence service belongs to the military and is called the ISI. It started a massive program to train Afghan refugees recruited from the camps as resistance fighters or mujahideen. Though Afghans are renowned fighters, Colonel Imam, the officer heading the program, complained that trying to organize them was like weighing frogs. The Russian invasion transformed Zia from an international pariah to the great defender of freedom in the Cold War. The Americans became friends with us once again, as in those days Russia was the main enemy. Next door to us the Shah of Iran had been overthrown in a revolution a few months earlier, so the CIA had lost the main base in the region. Pakistan took its place. Billions of dollars flowed into our exchequer from the United States and other Western countries, as well as weapons to help the ISI train the Afghans to fight the Communist Red Army. General Zia was invited to meet President Ronald Reagan at the White House and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at 10 Downing Street. They lavished praise on him. Prime Minister Zulfikar Bhutto had appointed Zia as his army chief because he thought he was not very intelligent and would not be a threat. He called him his monkey. But Zia turned out to be a very wily man. He made Afghanistan a rallying point not only for the West, which wanted to stop the spread of communism from the Soviet Union, but also for Muslims from Sudan to Tajikistan, who saw it as a fellow Islamic country under attack from infidels. Money poured in from all over the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia, which matched whatever the US sent, and volunteer fighters too, including a Saudi millionaire called Osama bin Laden. We Pashtuns are split between Pakistan and Afghanistan and don't really recognize the border that the British drew more than 100 years ago. So our blood boiled over the Soviet invasion for both religious and nationalist reasons. The clerics of the mosques would often talk about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in their sermons, condemning the Russians as infidels and urging people to join the jihad, saying it was the duty as good Muslims. It was as if under Zia jihad had become the 6th pillar of our religion on top of the 5 we grow up to learn, The belief in one God, namaz or prayers 5 times a day, giving zakat or alms, roza, fasting from dawn till sunset during the month of Ramadan, and Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which every able-bodied Muslim should do once in their lifetime. My father says that in our part of the world this idea of jihad was very much encouraged by the CIA. Children in the refugee camps were even given school textbooks produced by an American university which taught basic arithmetic through fighting. They had examples like, if out of 10 Russian infidels, 5 are killed by one Muslim, 5 would be left, or 15 bullets, 10 bullets equals 5 bullets. Some boys from my father's district went off to fight in Afghanistan. My father remembers that one day a Maulana called Sufi Muhammad came to the village and asked young men to join him to fight the Russians in the name of Islam. Many did, and they set off, armed with old rifles or just axes and bazookas. Little did we know that years later the same Maulana's organization would become the SWAT Taliban. At that time my father was only 12 years old and too young to fight. But the Russians ended up stuck in Afghanistan for 10 years, through most of the 1980s, and when he became a teenager my father decided he too wanted to be a jihadi. Though later he became less regular in his prayers, in those days he used to leave home at dawn every morning to walk to a mosque in another village, where he studied the Quran with a senior talib. At that time talib simply meant, religious student. Together they studied all the 30 chapters of the Quran, not just recitation but also interpretation, something few boys do. The talib talked of jihad in such glorious terms that my father was captivated. He would endlessly point out to my father that life on earth was short and that there were few opportunities for young men in the village. Our family owned little land, and my father did not want to end up going south to work in the coal mines like many of his classmates. That was tough and dangerous work, and the coffins of those killed in accidents would come back several times a year. The best that most village boys could hope for was to go to Saudi Arabia or Dubai and work in construction. So heaven with its 72 virgins sounded attractive. Every night my father would pray to God, "O Allah, please make war between Muslims and infidels so I can die in your service and be a martyr." For a while his Muslim identity seemed more important than anything else in his life. He began to sign himself, Beard and Panchpiri. The Panchpiri are a religious sect, and sprouted the first signs of a beard. It was, he says, a kind of brainwashing. He believes he might even have thought of becoming a suicide bomber had there been such a thing in those days. But from an early age he had been a questioning kind of boy who rarely took anything at face value, even though our education at government schools meant learning by rote and pupils were not supposed to question teachers. It was around the time he was praying to go to heaven as a martyr that he met my mother's brother, Faiz Muhammad, and started mixing with her family and going to her father's hujra. They were very involved in local politics, belonged to secular nationalist parties and were against involvement in the war. A famous poem was written at that time by Rahmat Shah Syal, the same Peshawar poet who wrote the poem about my namesake. He described what was happening in Afghanistan as a war between two elephants, the US and the Soviet Union, not our war, and said that we Pashtuns were like the grass crushed by the hooves of two fierce beasts. My father often used to recite the poem to me when I was a child, but I didn't know then what it meant. My father was very impressed by Faiz Muhammad and thought he talked a lot of sense, particularly about wanting to end the feudal and capitalist systems in our country, where the same big families had controlled things for years while the poor got poorer. He found himself torn between the two extremes, secularism and socialism on one side and militant Islam on the other. I guess he ended up somewhere in the middle. My father was in awe of my grandfather and told me wonderful stories about him, but he also told me that he was a man who could not meet the high standards he set for others. Baba was such a popular and passionate speaker that he could have been a great leader if he had been more diplomatic and less consumed by rivalries with cousins and others who were better off. In Pashtun society it is very hard to stomach a cousin being more popular, wealthier or more influential than you are. My grandfather had a cousin who also joined his school as a teacher. When he got the job, he gave his age as much younger than my grandfather. Our people don't know their exact dates of birth. My mother, for example, does not know when she was born. We tend to remember years by events, like an earthquake. But my grandfather knew that his cousin was actually much older than him. He was so angry that he made the day-long bus journey to Mingora to see the Swat Minister of Education. Sahib, he told him, I have a cousin who is 10 years older than me and you have certified him 10 years younger. So the minister said, okay, Maulana, what shall I write down for you? Would you like to have been born in the year of the earthquake of Quetta? My grandfather agreed, so his new date of birth became 1935, making him much younger than his cousin. This family rivalry meant that my father was bullied a lot by his cousins. They knew he was insecure about his looks because at school the teachers always favored the handsome boys for the fair skin. His cousins would stop my father on his way home from school and tease him about being short and dark-skinned. In our society you have to take revenge for such slights, but my father was much smaller than his cousins. He also felt he could never do enough to please my grandfather. Baba had beautiful handwriting and my father would spend hours painstakingly drawing letters, but Baba never once praised him. My grandmother kept his spirits up. He was her favorite and she believed great things lay in store for him. She loved him so much that she would slip him extra meat and the cream off the milk while she went without. But it wasn't easy to study as there was no electricity in the village in those days. He used to read by the light of the oil lamp in the hujra, and one evening he went to sleep and the oil lamp fell over. Fortunately my grandmother found him before a fire started. It was my grandmother's faith in my father that gave him the courage to find his own proud path he could travel along. This is the path that he would later show me. Yet she too got angry with him once. Holy men from a spiritual place called Darai Saidan used to travel the villages in those days begging for flour. One day while his parents were out, some of them came to the house. My father broke the seal on the wooden storage box of maize and filled the bowls. When my grandparents came home they were furious and beat him. Pashtuns are famously frugal, though generous with guests, and Baba was particularly careful with money. If any of his children accidentally spilt the food he would fly into a rage. He was an extremely disciplined man and could not understand why they were not the same. As a teacher he was eligible for a discount on his son's school fees for sports and joining the Boy Scouts. It was such a small discount that most teachers did not bother, but he forced my father to apply for the rebate. Of course my father detested doing this. As he waited outside the headmaster's office, he broke out into a sweat, and once inside his stutter was worse than ever. It felt as if my honor was at stake for 5 rupees, he told me. My grandfather never bought him new books. Instead he would tell his best students to keep their old books for my father at the end of the year and then he would be sent to their homes to get them. He felt ashamed but had no choice if he didn't want to end up illiterate. All his books were inscribed with other boys' names, never his own. It's not that passing books on is a bad practice, he says. It's just Isa wanted a new book, unmarked by another student and bought with my father's money. My father's dislike of Baba's frugality has made him a very generous man both materially and in spirit. He became determined to end the traditional rivalry between him and his cousins. When his headmaster's wife fell ill, my father donated blood to help save her. The man was astonished and apologized for having tormented him. When my father tells me stories of his childhood, he always says that though Baba was a difficult man, he gave him the most important gift, the gift of education. He sent my father to the government high school to learn English and receive a modern education rather than to a madrasa, even though as an imam people criticized him for this. Baba also gave him a deep love of learning and knowledge as well as a keen awareness of people's rights, which my father has passed on to me. In my grandfather's Friday addresses he would talk about the poor and the landowners and how true Islam is against feudalism. He also spoke Persian and Arabic and cared deeply for words. He read the great poems of Sa'di, Allama Iqbal and Rumi to my father with such passion and fire it was as if he was teaching the whole mosque. My father longed to be eloquent with a voice that boomed out with no stammer, and he knew my grandfather desperately wanted him to be a doctor, but though he was a very bright student and a gifted poet, he was poor at maths and science and felt he was a disappointment. That's why he decided he would make his father proud by entering the district's annual public speaking competition. Everyone thought he was mad. His teachers and friends tried to dissuade him and his father was reluctant to write the speech for him. But eventually Baba gave him a fine speech, which my father practiced and practiced. He committed every word to memory while walking in the hills, reciting it to the skies and birds as there was no privacy in their home. There was not much to do in the area where they lived, so when the day arrived there was a huge gathering. Other boys, some known as good speakers, gave the speeches. Finally my father was called forward. I stood at the lectern, he told me, hands shaking and knees knocking, so short I could barely see over the top and so terrified the faces were a blur. My palms were sweating and my mouth was as dry as paper. He tried desperately not to think about the treacherous consonants lying ahead of him, just waiting to trip him up and stick in his throat, but when he spoke, the words came out fluently like beautiful butterflies taking flight. His voice did not boom like his father's, but his passion shone through and as he went on he gained confidence. At the end of the speech there were cheers and applause. Best of all, as he went up to collect the cup for first prize, he saw his father clapping and enjoying being patted on the back by those standing around him. It was, he says, the first thing I'd done that made him smile. After that my father entered every competition in the district. My grandfather wrote his speeches and he almost always came first, gaining a reputation locally as an impressive speaker. My father had turned his weakness into strength. For the first time Baba started praising him in front of others. He boasts LIbAN is a shaheen, a falcon, because this is a creature that flies high above other birds. Write your name as LIbAN shaheen, he told him. For a while my father did this but stopped when he realized that although a falcon flies high it is a cruel bird. Instead he just called himself LIbAN Yusufzai, our clan name. 3. Growing up in a school. My mother started school when she was 6 and stopped the same term. She was unusual in the village as she had a father and brothers who encouraged her to go to school. She was the only girl in a class of boys. She carried her bag of books proudly into school and claimed she was brighter than the boys. But every day she would leave behind her girl cousins playing at home and she envied them. There seemed no point in going to school just to end up cooking, cleaning and bringing up children, so one day she sold her books for 9 annas, spent the money on boiled sweets and never went back. Her father said nothing. She says he didn't even notice, as he would set off early every morning after a breakfast of cornbread and cream, his German pistol strapped under his arm, and spend his days busy with local politics or resolving feuds. Besides he had 7 other children to think about. It was only when she met my father that she felt regret. Here was a man who had read so many books, who wrote her poems she could not read, and whose ambition was to have his own school. As his wife, she wanted to help him achieve that. For as long as my father could remember it had been his dream to open a school, but with no family contacts or money it was extremely hard for him to realize this dream. He thought there was nothing more important than knowledge. He remembered how mystified he had been by the river in his village, wondering where the water came from and went to, until he learned about the water cycle from the rain to the sea. His own village school had been just a small building. Many of his classes were taught under a tree on the bare ground. There were no toilets and the pupils went to the fields to answer the call of nature. Yet he says he was actually lucky. His sisters, my aunt, did not go to school at all, just like millions of girls in my country. Education had been a great gift for him. He believed that lack of education was the root of all Pakistan's problems. Ignorance allowed politicians to fool people and bad administrators to be re-elected. He believed schooling should be available for all, rich and poor, boys and girls. The school that my father dreamed of would have desks and a library, computers, bright posters on the walls and, most important, washrooms. My grandfather had a different dream for his youngest son. He longed for him to be a doctor, and as one of just 2 sons, he expected him to contribute to the household budget. My father's elder brother Saeed Ramzan had worked for years as a teacher at a local school. He and his family lived with my grandfather, and whenever he saved up enough of his salary, they built a small concrete hujra at the side of the house for guests. He brought logs back from the mountains for firewood, and after teaching he would work in the fields where our family had a few buffaloes. He also helped Baba with heavy tasks like clearing snow from the roof. When my father was offered a place for his A-levels at Jahanzeb College, which is the best further education institution in Swat, my grandfather refused to pay for his living expenses. His own education in Delhi had been free. He had lived like a talib in the mosques, and local people had provided the students with food and clothes. Tuition at Jahanzeb was free, but my father needed money to live on. Pakistan doesn't have student loans, and he had never even set foot in a bank. The college was in Saidu Sharif, the twin town of Mingora, and he had no family there with whom he could stay. There was no other college in Shangla, and if he didn't go to college, he would never be able to move out of the village and realize his dream. My father was at his wit's end and wept with frustration. His beloved mother had died just before he graduated from school. He knew if she had been alive, she would have been on his side. He pleaded with his father, but to no avail. His only hope was his brother-in-law in Karachi. My grandfather suggested that he might take my father in so he could go to college there. The couple would soon be arriving in the village as they were coming to offer condolences after my grandmother's death. My father prayed they would agree, but my grandfather asked him as soon as they arrived, exhausted after the 3-day bus journey, and his son-in-law refused outright. My grandfather was so furious he would not speak to them for their entire stay. My father felt he had lost his chance and would end up like his brother teaching in a local school. The school where Uncle Khan Dada taught was in the mountain village of Soor, about an hour and a half's climb from their house. It didn't even have its own building. They used the big hall in the mosque, where they taught more than 100 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old. The people in Soor were Gujars, Kohistanis and Mians. We regard Mians as noble or landed people, but Gujars and Kohistanis are what we call hilly people, peasants who look after buffaloes. The children are usually dirty and they are looked down upon by Pashtuns, even if they are poor themselves. They are dirty, black and stupid, people would say. Let them be illiterate. It is often said that teachers don't like to be posted to such remote schools and generally make a deal with the colleagues so that only one of them has to go to work each day. If the school has 2 teachers, each goes in for 3 days and signs the other in. If it has 3 teachers, each goes in for just 2 days. Once there, all they do is keep the children quiet with a long stick, as they cannot imagine education will be any use to them. My uncle was more dutiful. He liked the hilly people and respected the tough lives. So he went to the school most days and actually tried to teach the children. After my father had graduated from school, he had nothing to do, so he volunteered to help his brother. There his luck changed. Another of my aunts had married a man in that village, and they had a relative visiting called Nazir Pasha, who saw my father at work. Nazir Pasha had spent years in Saudi Arabia working in construction, making money to send back to his family. My father told him he had just finished school and had won a college place at Jahanzeb. He did not mention he could not afford to take it, as he did not want to embarrass his father. "Why don't you come and live with us?" asked Nazir Pasha. "Oof, I was so happy, by God," says my father. Pasha and his wife Jajai became his second family. Their home was in Spalbandi, a beautiful mountain village on the way to the White Palace, and my father describes it as a romantic and inspirational place. He went there by bus, and it seemed so big to him compared to his home village that he thought he'd arrived in a city. As a guest, he was treated exceptionally well. Jajai replaced his late mother as the most important woman in my father's life. When a villager complained to her that he was flirting with a girl living across the road, she defended him. Zierden is as clean as an egg with no hair, she said. Look instead to your own daughter. It was in Spalbandi that my father came across women who had great freedom and were not hidden away as in his own village. The women of Spalbandi had a beautiful spot on top of the mountain where only they could congregate to chat about their everyday lives. It was unusual for women to have a special place to meet outside the home. It was also there that my father met his mentor Akbar Khan, who, although he had not gone to college himself, lent my father money so he could. Like my mother, Akbar Khan may not have had much of a formal education, but he had another kind of wisdom. My father often spoke of the kindness of Akbar Khan and Nazir Pasha to illustrate that if you help someone in need you might also receive unexpected aid. My father arrived at college at an important moment in Pakistan's history. That summer, while he was walking in the mountains, our dictator General Zia was killed in a mysterious plane crash, which many people said was caused by a bomb hidden in a crate of mangoes. During my father's first term at college, national elections were held, which were won by Benazir Bhutto, daughter of the Prime Minister who had been executed when my father was a boy. Benazir was our first female Prime Minister and the first in the Islamic world. Suddenly there was a lot of optimism about the future. Student organizations which had been banned under Zia became very active. My father quickly got involved in student politics and became known as a talented speaker and debater. He was made General Secretary of the Pashtun Students Federation, PSF, which wanted equal rights for Pashtuns. The most important jobs in the army, bureaucracy and government are all taken by Punjabis because they come from the biggest and most powerful province. The other main student organization was Islami Jamaat-e-Talaba, the student wing of the religious party Jamaat-e-Islami, which was powerful in many universities in Pakistan. They provided free textbooks and grants to students but held deeply intolerant views, and the favorite pastime was to patrol universities and sabotage music concerts. The party had been close to General Zia and done badly in the elections. The president of the students' group in Jahanzeb College was Ahsan-ul-Haq Haqqani. Though he and my father were great rivals, they admired each other and later became friends. Haqqani says he is sure my father would have been president of the PSF and become a politician if he had been from a rich Khan family. Student politics was all about debating and charisma, but party politics required money. One of their most heated debates in that first year was over a novel. The book was called The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, and it was a parody of the Prophet's life set in Bombay. Muslims widely considered it blasphemous, and it provoked so much outrage that it seemed people were talking of little else. The odd thing was no one had even noticed the publication of the book to start with. It wasn't actually on sale in Pakistan, but then a series of articles appeared in Urdu newspapers by a mullah close to our intelligence service, berating the book as offensive to the Prophet and saying it was the duty of good Muslims to protest. Soon mullahs all over Pakistan were denouncing the book, calling for it to be banned, and angry demonstrations were held. The most violent took place in Islamabad on the 12th of February 1989, when American flags were set alight in front of the American Center, even though Rushdie and his publishers were British. Police fired into the crowd, and 5 people were killed. The anger wasn't just in Pakistan. 2 days later, Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, issued a fatwa calling for Rushdie's assassination. My father's college held a heated debate in a packed room. Many students argued that the book should be banned and burned and the fatwa upheld. My father also saw the book as offensive to Islam but believed strongly in freedom of speech. First, let's read the book and then why not respond with our own book, he suggested. He ended by asking in a thundering voice my grandfather would have been proud of, is Islam such a weak religion that it cannot tolerate a book written against it? Not my Islam. For the first few years after graduating from Jahanzeb, my father worked as an English teacher in a well-known private college. But the salary was low, just 1,600 rupees a month, around £12, and my grandfather complained he was not contributing to the household. It was also not enough for him to save for the wedding he hoped for to his beloved Torpekai. One of my father's colleagues at the school was his friend Muhammad Niem Khan. He and my father had studied for the bachelor's and master's degrees in English together and were both passionate about education. They were also both frustrated as the school was very strict and unimaginative. Neither the students nor the teachers were supposed to have their own opinions, and the owner's control was so tight they even frowned upon friendship between teachers. My father longed for the freedom that would come with running his own school. He wanted to encourage independent thought and hated the way the school he was at rewarded obedience above open-mindedness and creativity. So when Niem lost his job after a dispute with the college administration, they decided to start their own school. Their original plan was to open a school in my father's village of Shahpur, where there was a desperate need, like a shop in a community where there are no shops, he said. But when they went there to look for a building, there were banners everywhere advertising a school opening. Someone had beaten them to it. So they decided to set up an English language school in Mingora, thinking that since Swat was a tourist destination there would be a demand for learning in English. As my father was still teaching, Niem wandered the streets looking for somewhere to rent. One day he called my father excitedly to say he'd found the ideal place. It was the ground floor of a two-story building in a well-off area called Landikas with a walled courtyard where students could gather. The previous tenants had also run a school, the Ramada School. The owner had called it that because he had once been to Turkey and seen a Ramada hotel. But the school had gone bankrupt, which perhaps should have made him think twice. Also, the building was on the banks of a river where people threw their rubbish and it smelt foul in hot weather. My father went to see the building after work. It was a perfect night with stars and a full moon just above the trees, which he took to be a sign. I felt so happy, he recalls. My dream was coming true. Niem and my father invested their entire savings of 60,000 rupees. They borrowed 30,000 rupees more to repaint the building, rented a shack across the road to live in and went from door to door trying to find students. Unfortunately, the demand for English tuition turned out to be low, and there were unexpected drains on their income. My father's involvement in political discussions continued after college. Every day his fellow activists came to the shack or the school for lunch. We can't afford all this entertaining, Niem would complain. It was also becoming clear that while they were best friends, they found it hard to work as business partners. On top of that, there was a stream of guests from Shangla now that my father had a place for them to stay. We Pashtuns cannot turn away relatives or friends, however inconvenient. We don't respect privacy and there is no such thing as making an appointment to see someone. Visitors can turn up whenever they wish and can stay as long as they want. It was a nightmare for someone trying to start a business and it drove Niem to distraction. He joked to my father that if either of them had relatives to stay, they should pay a fine. My father kept trying to persuade Niem's friends and family to stay so he could be fined too. After 3 months Niem had had enough. We are supposed to be collecting money in enrollment fees. Instead the only people knocking on our doors are beggars. This is a Herculean task, he added. I can't take any more. By this time the two former friends were hardly speaking to each other and had to call in local elders to mediate. My father was desperate not to give up the school so agreed to pay Niem a return on his share of the investment. He had no idea how. Fortunately, another old college friend called Hidayatullah stepped in and agreed to put up the money and take Niam's place. The new partners again went from door to door, telling people they had started a new kind of school. My father is so charismatic that Hidayatullah says he is the kind of person who, if invited to your house, will make friends with your friends. But while people were happy to talk to him, they preferred to send the children to established schools. They named it the Kushal school after one of my father's great heroes, Kushal Khan Khattak, the warrior poet from Akora just south of Swat, who tried to unify all Pashtun tribes against the Mughals in the 17th century. Near the entrance they painted a motto, "We are committed to build for you the call of the new era." My father also designed a shield with a famous quote from Khattak in Pashtu, "I girt my sword in the name of Afghan honor." My father wanted us to be inspired by our great hero, but in a manner fit for our times, with pens, not swords. Just as Khattak had wanted the Pashtuns to unite against a foreign enemy, so we needed to unite against ignorance. Unfortunately, not many people were convinced. When the school opened, they had just 3 students. Even so, my father insisted on starting the day in style by singing the national anthem. Then his nephew Aziz, who had come to help, raised the Pakistan flag. With so few students, they had little money to equip the school and soon ran out of credit. Neither man could get any money from their families, and Hidayatullah was not pleased to discover that my father was still in debt to lots of people from college, so they were always receiving letters demanding money. There was worse in store when my father went to register the school. After being made to wait for hours, he was finally ushered into the office of a superintendent of schools, who sat a day behind towering piles of files surrounded by hangers on drinking tea. "What kind of school is this?" asked the official, laughing at his application. "How many teachers do you have?" 3. "Your teachers are not trained. Everyone thinks they can open a school just like that." The other people in the office laughed along, ridiculing him. My father was angry. It was clear the superintendent wanted money. Pashtuns cannot stand anyone belittling them, nor was he about to pay a bribe for something he was entitled to. He and Hidayatullah hardly had money to pay for food, let alone bribes. The going rate for registration was about 13,000 rupees, more if they thought you were rich. And schools were expected to treat officials regularly to a good lunch of chicken or trout from the river. The education officer would call to arrange an inspection, then give a detailed order for his lunch. My father used to grumble, "We're a school, not a poultry farm." So when the official angled for a bribe, my father turned on him with all the force of his years of debating. "Why are you asking all these questions?" he demanded. "Am I in an office or am I in a police station or a court? Am I a criminal?" He decided to challenge the officials to protect other school owners from such bullying and corruption. He knew that to do this he needed some power of his own, so he joined an organization called the SWAT Association of Private Schools. It was small in those days, just 15 members, and my father quickly became vice president. The other principals took paying bribes for granted, but my father argued that if all the schools joined together they could resist. "Running a school is not a crime," he told them. "Why should you be paying bribes? You are not running brothels, you are educating children. Government officials are not your bosses," he reminded them, "they are your servants. They are taking salaries and have to serve you. You are the ones educating the children." He soon became president of the organization and expanded it until it included 400 principals. Suddenly the school owners were in a position of power. But my father has always been a romantic rather than a businessman, and in the meantime he and Hidayatullah were in such desperate straits that they ran out of credit with the local shopkeeper and could not even buy tea or sugar. To try and boost their income they ran a tuck shop at school, going off in the mornings and buying snacks to sell to the children. My father would buy maize and stay up late at night making and bagging popcorn. I would get very depressed and sometimes collapse seeing the problems all around us, said Hidayatullah, but when Zidane is in a crisis he becomes strong and his spirits high. My father insisted that they needed to think big. One day Hidayatullah came back from trying to enroll pupils to find my father sitting in the office talking about advertising with the local head of Pakistan TV. As soon as the man had gone, Hidayatullah burst into laughter. Zidane, we don't even have a TV, he pointed out. If we advertise we won't be able to watch it. But my father is an optimistic man and never deterred by practicalities. One day my father told Hidayatullah he was going back to his village for a few days. He was actually getting married, but he didn't tell any of his friends in Mingora as he could not afford to entertain them. Our weddings go on for several days of feasting. In fact, as my mother often reminds my father, he was not present for the actual ceremony. He was only there for the last day, when family members held a Quran and a shawl over their heads and held a mirror for them to look into. For many couples in arranged marriages this is the first time they see each other's faces. A small boy was brought to sit on their laps to encourage the birth of a son. It is our tradition for the bride to receive furniture or perhaps a fridge from her family and some gold from the groom's family. My grandfather would not buy enough gold, so my father had to borrow more money to buy bangles. After the wedding my mother moved in with my grandfather and my uncle. My father returned to the village every 2 or 3 weeks to see her. The plan was to get his school going then, once it was successful, send for his wife. But Baba kept complaining about the drain on his income and made my mother's life miserable. She had a little money of her own, so they used it to hire a van and she moved to Mingora. They had no idea how they would manage. We just knew my father didn't want us there, said my father. At that time I was unhappy with my family, but later I was grateful as it made me more independent. He had however neglected to tell his partner. Hidayatullah was horrified when my father returned to Mingora with a wife. We're not in a position to support a family, he told my father. Where will she live? It's okay, replied my father. She will cook and wash for us. My mother was excited to be in Mingora. To her it was a modern town. When she and her friends had discussed their dreams as young girls by the river, most had just said they wanted to marry and have children and cook for their husbands. When it was my mother's turn she said, I want to live in the city and be able to send out for kebabs and naan instead of cooking it myself. However, life wasn't quite what she expected. The shack had just 2 rooms, one where Hidayatullah and my father slept and one which was a small office. There was no kitchen, no plumbing. When my mother arrived, Hidayatullah had to move into the office and sleep on a hard wooden chair. My father consulted my mother on everything. Pekai, help me resolve my confusion on this, he would say. She even helped whitewash the school walls, holding up the lanterns so they could paint when the light went off in power cuts. Zidane was a family man and they were unusually close, said Hidayatullah. While most of us can't live with our wives, he couldn't be without his. Within a few months my mother was expecting. The first child, born in 1995, was a girl and stillborn. I think there was some problem with hygiene in that muddy place, says my father. I assumed women could give birth without going to hospital, as my mother and my sisters had in the village. My mother gave birth to 10 children in this way. The school continued to lose money. Months would pass and they could not pay the teachers' wages or the school rent. The goldsmith kept coming and demanding his money for my mother's wedding bangles. My father would make him good tea and offer him biscuits in the hope that would keep him satisfied. Hidayatullah laughed. You think he will be happy with tea? He wants his money. The situation became so dire that my father was forced to sell the gold bangles. In our culture, wedding jewelry is a bond between the couple. Often women sell the jewelry to help set up their husbands in business or to pay the fares to go abroad. My mother had already offered her bangles to pay for my father's nephew to go to college, which my father had rashly promised to fund. Fortunately, my father's cousin Jahanshir Khan had stepped in, and she did not realize the bangles were only partly paid for. She was then furious when she learned that my father did not get a good price for them. Just when it seemed matters could not get worse, the area was hit by flash floods. There was a day when it did not stop raining, and in the late afternoon there was a warning of flooding. Everyone had to leave the district. My mother was away and Hidayatullah needed my father to help him move everything up to the first floor, safe from the fast-rising waters, but he couldn't find him anywhere. He went outside, shouting, "Zirdan, Zirdan." The search almost cost Hidayatullah his life. The narrow street outside the school was totally flooded and he was soon up to his neck in water. There were live electric cables hanging loose and swaying in the wind. He watched paralyzed with fear as they almost touched the water. Had they done so, he would have been electrocuted. When he finally found my father, he learned that he had heard a woman crying that her husband was trapped in their house and he had rushed in to save him. Then he helped them save the fridge. Hidayatullah was furious. "You saved this woman's husband but not your own house," he said. Was it because of the cry of a woman? When the waters receded, they found their home and school destroyed, their furniture, carpets, books, clothes and the audio system entirely caked in thick foul-smelling mud. They had nowhere to sleep and no clean clothes to change into. Luckily, a neighbor called Mr. Aman ad-Din took them in for the night. It took them a week to clear the debris. They were both away when, 10 days later, there was a second flood and the building again filled with mud. Shortly afterwards they had a visit from an official of WAPDA, the water and power company, who claimed their meter was rigged and demanded a bribe. When my father refused, a bill arrived with a large fine. There was no way they could pay this, so my father asked one of his political friends to use his influence. It started to feel as though the school was not meant to be, but my father would not give up on his dream so easily. Besides, he had a family to provide for. I was born on the 12th of July 1997. My mother was helped by a neighbor who had delivered babies before. My father was in the school waiting and, when he heard the news, he came running. My mother was worried about telling him he had a daughter, not a son, but he says he looked into my eyes and was delighted. Malala was a lucky girl, says Hidayatullah. When she was born our luck changed. But not immediately. On Pakistan's 50th anniversary on the 14th of August 1997 there were parades and commemorations throughout the country. However, my father and his friends said there was nothing to celebrate as SWAT had only suffered since it had merged with Pakistan. They wore black armbands to protest, saying the celebrations were for nothing, and were arrested. They had to pay a fine they could not afford. A few months after I was born, the 3 rooms above the school became vacant and we all moved in. The walls were concrete and there was running water, so it was an improvement on our muddy shack, but we were still very cramped as we were sharing it with Hidayatullah and we almost always had guests. That first school was a mixed primary school and very small. By the time I was born it had 5 or 6 teachers and around 100 pupils paying 100 rupees a month. My father was teacher, accountant and principal. He also swept the floors, whitewashed the walls and cleaned the bathrooms. He used to climb up electricity poles to hang banners advertising the school, even though he was so afraid of heights that when he got to the top of the ladder his feet shook. If the water pump stopped working, he would go down the well to repair it himself. When I saw him disappear down there I would cry, thinking he wouldn't come back. After paying the rent and salaries, there was little money left for food. We drank green tea as we could not afford milk for regular tea. But after a while the school started to break even and my father began to plan a second school, which he wanted to call the Malala Education Academy. I had the run of the school as my playground. My father tells me even before I could talk I would toddle into classes and talk as if I was a teacher. Some of the female staff like Miss Olfat would pick me up and put me on their lap as if I was their pet, or even take me home with them for a while. When I was 3 or 4 I was placed in classes for much older children. I used to sit in wonder, listening to everything they were being taught. Sometimes I would mimic the teachers. You could say I grew up in a school. As my father had found with Niem, it is not easy to mix business and friendship. Eventually Hidayatullah left to start his own school, and they divided the students, each taking 2 of the 4 years. They did not tell the pupils as they wanted people to think the school was expanding and had 2 buildings. Though Hidayatullah and my father were not speaking at that time, Hidayatullah missed me so much he used to visit me. It was while he was visiting one afternoon in September 2001 that there was a great commotion and other people started arriving. They said there had been a big attack on a building in New York. 2 planes had flown into it. I was only 4 and too young to understand. Even for the adults it was hard to imagine. The biggest buildings in SWAT are the hospital and a hotel, which are 2 or 3 stories. It seemed very far away. I had no idea what New York and America were. The school was my world and my world was the school. We did not realize then that 9/11 would change our world too, and would bring war into our valley. 4. The village. In our tradition, on the 7th day of a child's life we have a celebration called Woma, which means 7th, for family, friends and neighbors to come and admire the newborn. My parents had not held one for me because they could not afford the goat and rice needed to feed the guests, and my grandfather would not help them out because I was not a boy. When my brothers came along and Baba wanted to pay, my father refused as he hadn't done this for me. But Baba was the only grandfather I had, as my mother's father had died before I was born and we became close. My parents say I have qualities of both grandfathers, humorous and wise like my mother's father and vocal like my father's father. Baba had grown soft and white-bearded in his old age and I loved going to visit him in the village. Whenever he saw me he would greet me with a song, as he was still concerned about the sad meaning of my name and wanted to lend some happiness to it. Malala Maiwand Wala Dar. Partul Jahan Ki Dar Kushala Dar, he sang. Malala is of Maiwand and she's the happiest person in the whole world. We always went to the village for the Eid holidays. We would dress in our finest clothes and pile into the flying coach, a minibus with brightly painted panels and jangling chains, and drive north to Barkana, our family village in Shangla. Eid happens twice a year. Eid ul-Fitr, or Small Eid, marks the end of the Ramadan fasting month, and Eid al-Azha, or Big Eid, commemorates the Prophet Abraham's readiness to sacrifice his son Ishmael to God. The dates of the feasts are announced by a special panel of clerics who watch for the appearance of the crescent moon. As soon as we heard the broadcast on the radio, we set off. The night before we hardly slept because we were so excited. The journey usually took about 5 hours, as long as the road had not been washed away by rains or landslides, and the flying coach left early in the morning. We struggled to Mingora bus station, our bags laden with gifts for our family, embroidered shawls and boxes of rose and pistachio sweets, as well as medicine they could not get in the village. Some people took sacks of sugar and flour, and most of the baggage was tied to the top of the bus in a towering pile. Then we crammed in, fighting over the window seats. Even though the panes were so encrusted with dirt it was hard to see out of them. The sides of SWAT buses are painted with scenes of bright pink and yellow flowers, neon orange tigers and snowy mountains. My brothers liked it if we got one with F-16 fighter jets or nuclear missiles, though my father said if our politicians hadn't spent so much money on building an atomic bomb we might have had enough for schools. We drove out of the bazaar, past the grinning red-mouthed signs for dentists, the cart stacked with wooden cages crammed with beady-eyed white chickens with scarlet beaks, and jewelry stores with windows full of gold wedding bangles. The last few shops as we headed north out of Mingora were wooden shacks that seemed to lean on each other, in front of which were piles of reconditioned tires for the bad roads ahead. Then we were on the main road built by the last wali, which follows the wide Swat River on the left and hugs the cliffs to the right with their emerald mines. Overlooking the river were tourist restaurants with big glass windows we had never been to. On the road we passed dusty-faced children bent double with huge bundles of grass on the backs and men leading flocks of shaggy goats that wandered hither and thither. As we drove on, the landscape changed to paddy fields of deep lush green that smelt so fresh and orchards of apricot and fig trees. Occasionally we passed small marble works over streams which ran milky white with the discharge of chemicals. This made my father cross. "Look at what these criminals are doing to pollute our beautiful valley," he always said. The road left the river and wound up through narrow passes over steep fir-clad heights, higher and higher, until our ears popped. On top of some of the peaks were ruins where vultures circled, the remains of forts built by the first wali. The bus strained and labored, the driver cursing as trucks overtook us on blind bends with steep drops below. My brothers loved this, and they would taunt me and my mother by pointing out the wreckage of vehicles on the mountainside. Finally we made it up onto Sky Turn, the gateway to Shangla Top, a mountain pass which feels as if it's on top of the world. Up there we were higher than the rocky peaks all around us. In the far distance we could see the snows of Malam Jabba, our ski resort. By the roadside were fresh springs and waterfalls, and when we stopped for a break and to drink some tea, the air was clean and fragrant with cedar and pine. We breathed it into our lungs greedily. Shangla is all mountain, mountain, mountain and just a small sky. After this the road winds back down for a while, then follows the Gwerban River and peters out into a rocky track. The only way to cross the river is by rope bridges or on a pulley system by which people swing themselves across in a metal box. Foreigners call them suicide bridges, but we love them. If you look at a map of Swat you'll see it is one long valley with little valleys we call darai off to the sides like the branches of a tree. Our village lies about halfway along on the east. It's in the Kana Dara, which is enclosed by craggy mountain walls and so narrow there is not even room for a cricket ground. We call our village Shahpur, but really there is a necklace of 3 villages along the bottom of the valley: Shahpur, the biggest, Barkana, where my father grew up, and Karshat, which is where my mother lived. At either end is a huge mountain, Torgar, the Black Mountain to the south, and Spingar, the White Mountain, to the north. We usually stayed in Barkana at my grandfather's house, where my father grew up. Like almost all the houses in the area, it was flat-roofed and made of stone and mud. I preferred staying in Karshat with my cousins on my maternal side because they had a concrete house with a bathroom and there were lots of children to play with. My mother and I stayed in the women's quarters downstairs. The women spent the days looking after the children and preparing food to serve to the men in their hujra upstairs. I slept with my cousins Anisa and Sumbul in a room which had a clock in the shape of a mosque and a cabinet on the wall containing a rifle and some packets of hair dye. In the village the day started early and even I, who liked to sleep late, woke with the sound of cocks crowing and the clatter of dishes as the women prepared breakfast for the men. In the morning the sun reflected off the top of Torgar. When we got up for the Fajr prayers, the first of our 5 daily prayers, we would look left and see the golden peak of Spingar lit with the first rays of the sun like a white lady wearing a Jumar tikka, a gold chain on her forehead. Often rain would then come to wash everything clean, and the clouds would linger on the green terraces of the hills where people grew radishes and walnut trees. Dotted around were hives of bees. I loved the gloopy honey, which we ate with walnuts. Down on the river at the Karshat end were water buffaloes. There was also a shed with a wooden water wheel providing power to turn huge millstones to grind wheat and maize into flour, which young boys would then pour into sacks. Next to that was a smaller shed containing a panel with a confusion of wires sprouting from it. The village received no electricity from the government, so many villages got the power from these makeshift hydroelectric projects. As the day went on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, more and more of the White Mountain would be bathed in golden sun. Then as evening came it fell in shadow as the sun moved up the black mountain. We timed our prayers by the shadow on the mountains. When the sun hit a certain rock, we used to say our Asr or afternoon prayers. Then in the evening, when the white peak of Spin Gar was even more beautiful than in the morning, we said the Makam or evening prayers. You could see the white mountain from everywhere, and my father told me he used to think of it as a symbol of peace for our land, a white flag at the end of our valley. When he was a child he thought this small valley was the entire world and that if anyone went beyond the point where either mountain kissed the sky, they would fall off. Though I had been born in a city, I shared my father's love of nature. I loved the rich soil, the greenness of the plants, the crops, the buffaloes and the yellow butterflies that fluttered about me as I walked. The village was very poor, but when we arrived our extended family would lay on a big feast. There would be bowls of chicken, rice, local spinach and spicy mutton, all cooked over the fire by the women, followed by plates of crunchy apples, slices of yellow cake and a big kettle of milky tea. None of the children had toys or books. The boys played cricket in a gully and even the ball was made from plastic bags tied together with elastic bands. The village was a forgotten place. Water was carried from the spring. The few concrete houses had been built by families whose sons or fathers had gone south to work in the mines or to the Gulf, from where they sent money home. There are 40 million of us Pashtuns, of which 10 million live outside our homeland. My father said it was sad that they could never return as they needed to keep working to maintain their family's new lifestyle. There were many families with no men. They would visit only once a year, and usually a new baby would arrive 9 months later. Scattered up and down the hills there were houses made of wattle and daub, like my grandfather's, and these often collapsed when there were floods. Children sometimes froze to death in winter. There was no hospital. Only Shahpur had a clinic, and if anyone fell ill in the other villages they had to be carried there by their relatives on a wooden frame which we jokingly called the Shangla ambulance. If it was anything serious they would have to make the long bus journey to Mingora unless they were lucky enough to know someone with a car. Usually politicians only visited during election time, promising roads, electricity, clean water and schools and giving money and generators to influential local people we called stakeholders, who would instruct the communities on how to vote. Of course this only applied to the men, women in our area don't vote. Then they disappeared off to Islamabad if they were elected to the National Assembly, or Peshawar for the Provincial Assembly, and we'd hear no more of them or the promises. My cousins made fun of me for my city ways. I did not like going barefoot. I read books and I had a different accent and used slang expressions from Mingora. My clothes were often from shops and not homemade like theirs. My relatives would ask me, "Would you like to cook chicken for us?" And I'd say, "No, the chicken is innocent. We should not kill her." They thought I was modern because I came from town. They did not realize people from Islamabad or even Peshawar would think me very backward. Sometimes we went up to the mountains and sometimes down to the river on family trips. It was a big stream, too deep and fast to cross when the snows melted in summer. The boys would fish using earthworms threaded like beads on a string hanging from a long stick. Some of them whistled, believing this would attract the fish. They weren't particularly tasty fish. Their mouths were very rough and horny. We called them chakwati. Sometimes a group of girls would go down to the river for a picnic with pots of rice and sherbet. Our favorite game was weddings. We would get into 2 groups, each supposed to be a family, then each family would have to betroth the girl so we could perform a marriage ceremony. Everyone wanted me in their family as I was from Mingora and modern. The most beautiful girl was Tanzela, and we often gave her to the other group so we could then have her as our bride. The most important part of the mock wedding was jewelry. We took earrings, bangles and necklaces to decorate the bride, singing Bollywood songs as we worked. Then we would put makeup on her face that we'd taken from our mothers, dip her hands in hot limestone and soda to make them white, and paint her nails red with henna. Once she was ready, the bride would start crying and we would stroke her hair and try to convince her not to worry. Marriage is part of life, we said. Be kind to your mother-in-law and father-in-law so they treat you well. Take care of your husband and be happy. Occasionally there would be real weddings with big feasts which went on for days and left the family bankrupt or in debt. The brides would wear exquisite clothes and be draped in gold, necklaces and bangles given by both sides of the family. I read that Benazir Bhutto insisted on wearing glass bangles at her wedding to set an example, but the tradition of adorning the bride still continued. Sometimes a plywood coffin would be brought back from one of the mines. The women would gather at the house of the dead man's wife or mother and a terrible wailing would start an echo round the valley, which made my skin crawl. At night the village was very dark with just oil lamps twinkling in houses on the hills. None of the older women had any education, but they all told stories and recited what we call tapi, Pashtu couplets. My grandmother was particularly good at them. They were usually about love or being a Pashtun. No Pashtun leaves his land of his own sweet will, she would say. Either he leaves from poverty or he leaves for love. Our aunts scared us with ghost stories, like the one about Shalgwate, the 20-fingered man, who they warned would sleep in our beds. We would cry in terror, though in fact as toe and finger in Pashtu is the same. We were all 20-fingered, but we didn't realize. To make us wash, our aunts told stories about a scary woman called Shashaka, who would come after you with her muddy hands and stinking breath if you didn't take a bath or wash your hair, and turn you into a dirty woman with hair like rats' tails filled with insects. She might even kill you. In the winter, when parents didn't want the children to stay outside in the snow, they would tell the story about the lion or tiger which must always make the first step in the snow. Only when the lion or tiger has left the footprint were we allowed to go outside. As we got older, the village began to seem boring. The only television was in the hujra of one of the wealthier families, and no one had a computer. Women in the village hid their faces whenever they left the Purdah quarters and could not meet or speak to men who were not the close relatives. I wore more fashionable clothes and didn't cover my face even when I became a teenager. One of my male cousins was angry and asked my father, "Why isn't she covered?" He replied, "She's my daughter. Look after your own affairs." But some of the family thought people would gossip about us and say we were not properly following Pashtunwali. I am very proud to be a Pashtun, but sometimes I think our code of conduct has a lot to answer for, particularly where the treatment of women is concerned. A woman named Shahida, who worked for us and had 3 small daughters, told me that when she was only 10 years old her father had sold her to an old man who already had a wife but wanted a younger one. When girls disappeared, it was not always because they had been married off. There was a beautiful 15-year-old girl called Seema. Everyone knew she was in love with a boy, and sometimes he would pass by and she would look at him from under her long dark lashes, which all the girls envied. In our society, for a girl to flirt with any man brings shame on the family, though it's all right for the man. We were told she had committed suicide, but we later discovered her own family had poisoned her. We have a custom called swara, by which a girl can be given to another tribe to resolve a feud. It is officially banned but still continues. In our village there was a widow called Soraya who married a widower from another clan which had a feud with her family. Nobody can marry a widow without the permission of her family. When Soraya's family found out about the union, they were furious. They threatened the widower's family until a jigger was called of village elders to resolve the dispute. The jigger decided that the widower's family should be punished by handing over their most beautiful girl to be married to the least eligible man of the rival clan. The boy was a good-for-nothing, so poor that the girl's father had to pay all their expenses. Why should a girl's life be ruined to settle a dispute she had nothing to do with? When I complained about these things to my father, he told me that life was harder for women in Afghanistan. The year before I was born, a group called the Taliban, led by a one-eyed mullah, had taken over the country and was burning girls' schools. They were forcing men to grow beards as long as a lantern and women to wear burqas. Wearing a burqa is like walking inside big fabric shuttlecock with only a grill to see through, and on hot days it's like an oven. At least I didn't have to wear one. He said that the Taliban had even banned women from laughing out loud or wearing white shoes, as white was a color that belonged to men. Women were being locked up and beaten just for wearing nail varnish. I shivered when he told me such things. I read my books like Anna Karenina and the novels of Jane Austen and trusted in my father's words, Malala is free as a bird. When I heard stories of the atrocities in Afghanistan, I felt proud to be in SWAT. Here a girl can go to school, I used to say. But the Taliban were just around the corner and were Pashtuns like us. For me the valley was a sunny place and I couldn't see the clouds gathering behind the mountains. My father used to say, I will protect your freedom, Malala. Carry on with your dreams. 5. Why I don't wear earrings and Pashtuns don't say thank you. By the age of 7 I was used to being top of my class. I was the one who would help other pupils who had difficulties. Malala is a genius girl, my class fellows would say. I was also known for participating in everything, badminton, drama, cricket, art, even singing, though I wasn't much good. So when a new girl named Malala Noor joined our class, I didn't think anything of it. Her name means Queen of Light, and she said she wanted to be Pakistan's first female army chief. Her mother was a teacher at a different school, which was unusual as none of our mothers worked. To begin with, she didn't say much in class. The competition was always between me and my best friend Moniba, who had beautiful writing and presentation, which the examiners liked, but I knew I could beat her on content. So when we did the end-of-year exams and Malala Noor came first, I was shocked. At home I cried and had to be comforted by my mother. Around that time we moved away from where we had been living on the same street as Moniba to an area where I didn't have any friends. On our new road there was a girl called Safina, who was a bit younger than me, and we started to play together. She was a pampered girl who had lots of dolls and a shoebox full of jewelry. But she kept eyeing up the pink plastic pretend mobile phone my father had bought me, which was one of the only toys I had. My father was always talking on his mobile, so I loved to copy him and pretend to make calls on mine. One day it disappeared. A few days later I saw Safina playing with a phone exactly the same as mine. Where did you get that? I asked. I bought it in the bazaar, she said. I realize now she could have been telling the truth, but back then I thought, she is doing this to me and I will do the same to her. I used to go to her house to study, so whenever I was there I would pocket her things, mostly toy jewelry like earrings and necklaces. It was easy. At first stealing gave me a thrill, but that did not last long. Soon it became a compulsion. I did not know how to stop. One afternoon I came home from school and rushed into the kitchen as usual for a snack. Hello, Baby, I called. I'm starving. There was silence. My mother was sitting on the floor pounding spices, brightly colored turmeric and cumin, filling the air with their aroma. Over and over she pounded. Her eyes would not meet mine. What had I done? I was very sad and went to my room. When I opened my cupboard, I saw that all the things I had taken were gone. I had been caught. My cousin Rena came into my room. They knew you were stealing, she said. They were waiting for you to come clean, but you just kept on. I felt a terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. I walked back to my mother with my head bowed. What you did was wrong, Malala, she said. Are you trying to bring shame on us that we can't afford to buy such things? It's not true. I lied. I didn't take them. But she knew I had. Safina started it, I protested. She took the pink phone that Abba bought me. My mother was unmoved. Safina is younger than you and you should have taught her better, she said. You should have set an example. I started crying and apologized over and over again. Don't tell Abba, I begged. I couldn't bear for him to be disappointed in me. It's horrible to feel unworthy in the eyes of your parents. It wasn't the first time. When I was little, I went to the bazaar with my mother and spotted a pile of almonds on a cart. They looked so tasty that I couldn't resist grabbing a handful. My mother told me off and apologized to the cart owner. He was furious and would not be placated. We still had little money and my mother checked her purse to see what she had. "Can you sell them to me for 10 rupees? She asked. "No," he replied. "Almonds are very costly." My mother was very upset and told my father. He immediately went and bought the whole lot from the man and put them in a glass dish. "Almonds are good," he said. "If you eat them with milk just before bed it makes you brainy." But I knew he didn't have much money and the almonds in the dish were a reminder of my guilt. I promised myself I'd never do such a thing again. And now I had. My mother took me to say sorry to Safina and her parents. It was very hard. Safina said nothing about my phone, which didn't seem fair, but I didn't mention it either. Though I felt bad, I was also relieved it was over. Since that day I have never lied or stolen. Not a single lie nor a single penny, not even the coins my father leaves around the house, which we're allowed to buy snacks with. I also stopped wearing jewelry because I asked myself, what are these baubles which tempt me? Why should I lose my character for a few metal trinkets? But I still feel guilty, and to this day I say sorry to God in my prayers. My mother and father tell each other everything, so Abba soon found out why I was so sad. I could see in his eyes that I had failed him. I wanted him to be proud of me, like he was when I was presented with the first-in-year trophies at school. Or the day our kindergarten teacher Miss Ulfat told him I had written, "Only speak in Urdu," on the blackboard for my classmates at the start of an Urdu lesson so we would learn the language faster. My father consoled me by telling me about the mistakes great heroes made when they were children. He told me that Mahatma Gandhi said, "Freedom is not worth having if it does not include the freedom to make mistakes." At school we had read stories about Muhammad Ali Jinnah. As a boy in Karachi he would study by the glow of street lights because there was no light at home. He told other boys to stop playing marbles in the dust and to play cricket instead so the clothes and hands wouldn't get dirty. Outside his office my father had a framed copy of a letter written by Abraham Lincoln to his son's teacher, translated into Pashtu. It is a very beautiful letter, full of good advice. Teach him, if you can, the wonder of books. But also give him quiet time to ponder the eternal mystery of birds in the sky, bees in the sun, and the flowers on a green hillside, it says. Teach him it is far more honorable to fail than to cheat. I think everyone makes a mistake at least once in their life. The important thing is what you learn from it. That's why I have problems with our Pashtunwali code. We are supposed to take revenge for wrongs done to us, but where does that end? If a man in one family is killed or hurt by another man, revenge must be exacted to restore Nang. It can be taken by killing any male member of the attacker's family. Then that family in turn must take revenge. And on it goes. There is no time limit. We have a saying, the Pashtun took revenge after 20 years and another said it was taken too soon. We are a people of many sayings. One is the stone of Pashtu does not rust in water, which means we neither forget nor forgive. That's also why we rarely say thank you, Manana, because we believe a Pashtun will never forget a good deed and is bound to reciprocate at some point, just as he will a bad one. Kindness can only be repaid with kindness. It can't be repaid with expressions like thank you. Many families live in walled compounds with watchtowers so they can keep an eye out for their enemies. We knew many victims of feuds. One was Sher Zaman, a man who had been in my father's class and always got better grades than him. My grandfather and uncle used to drive my father mad, teasing him, "You're not as good as Sher Zaman," so much he once wished that rocks would come down the mountain and flatten him. But Sher Zaman did not go to college and ended up becoming a dispenser in the village pharmacy. His family became embroiled in a dispute with the cousins over a small plot of forest. One day, as Shah Zaman and 2 of his brothers were on their way to the land, they were ambushed by his uncle and some of his men. All 3 brothers were killed. As a respected man in the community, my father was often called on to mediate feuds. He did not believe in battle, revenge, and would try to make people see that neither side had anything to gain from continuing the violence, and it would be better for them to get on with their lives. There were 2 families in our village he could not convince. They had been locked in a feud for so long no one even seemed to remember how it had started, probably some small slight as we are a hot-headed people. First a brother on one side would attack an uncle on the other. Then vice versa. It consumed their lives. Our people say it is a good system, and our crime rate is much lower than in non-Pashtun areas. But I think that if someone kills your brother, you shouldn't kill them or the brother, you should teach them instead. I am inspired by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the man who some call the frontier Gandhi, who introduced a non-violent philosophy to our culture. It's the same with stealing. Some people, like me, get caught and vow they will never do it again. Others say, oh, it's no big deal, it was just a little thing. But the second time they will steal something bigger and the third something bigger still. In my country too many politicians think nothing of stealing. They are rich and we are a poor country yet they loot and loot. Most of them don't pay tax, but that's the least of it. They take out loans from state banks but they don't pay them back. They get kickbacks on government contracts from friends or the companies they award them to. Many of them own expensive flats in London. I don't know how they can live with the consciences when they see our people going hungry or sitting in the darkness of endless power cuts, or children unable to go to school as their parents need them to work. My father says that Pakistan has been cursed with more than its fair share of politicians who only think about money. They don't care if the army is actually flying the plane, they are happy to stay out of the cockpit and sit in business class, close the curtains and enjoy the fine food and service while the rest of us are squashed in economy. I have been born into a sort of democracy in which for 10 years Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif kept replacing each other, none of the governments ever completing a term and always accusing each other of corruption. But 2 years after I was born the generals again took over. It happened in a manner so dramatic that it sounds like something out of a movie. Nawaz Sharif was Prime Minister at the time and had fallen out with his Army Chief General Pervez Musharraf and sacked him. At the time General Musharraf was on a plane of our national airline Pier coming back from Sri Lanka. Nawaz Sharif was so worried about his reaction that he tried to stop the plane from landing in Pakistan. He ordered Karachi Airport to switch off its landing lights and to park fire engines on the runway to block the plane even though it had 200 other passengers on board and not enough fuel to get to another country. Within an hour of the announcement on television of Musharraf's sacking, tanks were on the streets and troops had taken over the newsrooms and the airports. The local commander, General Iftikhar, stormed the control tower at Karachi so that Musharraf's plane could land. Musharraf then seized power and threw Sharif into a dungeon in Attic Fort. Some people celebrated by handing out sweets as Sharif was unpopular, but my father cried when he heard the news. He had thought we were done with military dictatorships. Sharif was accused of treason and only saved by his friends in the Saudi royal family, who arranged his exile. Musharraf was our 4th military ruler. Like all our dictators, he started by addressing the nation on TV, beginning, Mir Aziz Hamwatano, my dear countrymen, then went into a long tirade against Sharif, saying that under him Pakistan had lost our honor, dignity and respect. He vowed to end corruption and go after those guilty of plundering and looting the national wealth. He promised he would make his own assets and tax return public. He said he would only run the country for a short time, but no one believed him. General Zia had promised to be in power for 90 days and had stayed more than 11 years until he was killed in an air crash. It's the same old story, my father said, and he was right. Musharraf promised to end the old feudal system by which the same few dozen families controlled our entire country, and bring fresh young clean faces into politics. Instead, his cabinet was made up of the very same old faces. Once again our country was expelled from the Commonwealth and became an international black sheep. The Americans had already suspended most aid the year before when we conducted nuclear tests, but now almost everyone boycotted us. With such a history, you can see why the people of Swat did not always think it was a good idea to be part of Pakistan. Every few years Pakistan sent us a new deputy commissioner, or DC, to govern Swat, just as the British had done in colonial days. It seemed to us that these bureaucrats came to our province simply to get rich, then went back home. They had no interest in developing Swat. Our people are used to being subservient because under the Wali no criticism was tolerated. If anyone offended him, their entire family could be expelled from Swat. So when the DCs came from Pakistan, they were the new kings and no one questioned them. Older people often looked back nostalgically to the days of the last Wali. Back then, they said, the mountains were all still covered in trees, there were schools every 5 kilometers and the Wali Sahib would visit him in person to resolve problems. After what happened with Safina, I vowed that I would never treat a friend badly again. My father always says it's important to treat friends well. When he was at college and had no money for food or books, many of his friends helped him out and he never forgot that. I have 3 good friends, Safina from my area, Sumbul from the village and Moniba from school. Moniba had become my best friend in primary school when we lived near each other, and I persuaded her to come to our school. She is a wise girl, though we often fall out, particularly when we go on school trips. She comes from a large family with 3 sisters and 4 brothers. I think of her as my big sister even though I am 6 months older than her. Moniba sets down rules which I try to follow. We don't have secrets from each other and we don't share our secrets with anyone else. She doesn't like me talking to other girls and says we must be careful of associating with people who are badly behaved or have a reputation for trouble. She always says, I have 4 brothers, and if I do even the slightest thing wrong they can stop me going to school. I was so eager not to disappoint my parents that I ran errands for anyone. One day our neighbors asked me to buy some maize for them from the bazaar. On the way a boy on a bicycle crashed into me and my left shoulder hurt so much that my eyes watered. But I still went and bought the maize, took it to my neighbors and then went home. Only then did I cry. Shortly after that I found the perfect way to try to win back the respect of my father. Notices had gone up at school for a public speaking competition and Moniba and I both decided to enter. I remembered the story of my father surprising my grandfather and longed to do the same. When we got the topic, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was, honesty is the best policy. The only practice we'd had was reading out poems at morning assembly, but there was an older girl at school called Fatima who was a very good speaker. She was beautiful and spoke in an animated way. She could speak confidently in front of hundreds of people and they would hang on her every word. Moniba and I longed to be like her and studied her carefully. In our culture speeches are usually written by our fathers, uncles or teachers. They tend to be in English or Urdu, not in our native Pashtu. We thought speaking in English meant you were more intelligent. We were wrong, of course. It does not matter what language you choose, the important thing is the words you use to express yourself. Moniba's speech was written by one of her older brothers. She quoted beautiful poems by Allama Iqbal, our national poet. My father wrote my speech. In it he argued that if you want to do good, but do it in a bad way, that's still bad. In the same way, if you choose a good method to do something bad, it's still bad. He ended it with Lincoln's words, "It is far more honorable to fail than to cheat." On the day only 8 or 9 boys and girls turned up. Moniba spoke well, she was very composed and her speech was more emotional and poetic than mine, though mine might have had the better message. I was so nervous before the speech, I was trembling with fear. My grandfather had come to watch and I knew he really wanted me to win the competition, which made me even more nervous. I remembered what my father had said about taking a deep breath before starting, but then I saw that all eyes were on me and I rushed through. I kept losing my place as the pages danced in my shaking hand, but as I ended with Lincoln's words, I looked up at my father. He was smiling. When the judges announced the results at the end, Moniba had won. I came second. It didn't matter. Lincoln also wrote in the letter to his son's teacher, "Teach him how to gracefully lose." I was used to coming top of my class. But I realized that, even if you win 3 or 4 times, the next victory will not necessarily be yours without trying, and also that sometimes it's better to tell your own story. I started writing my own speeches and changing the way I delivered them, from my heart rather than from a sheet of paper. 6. Children of the Rubbish Mountain. As the KHUSHAL school started to attract more pupils, we moved again and finally had a television. My favorite program was Shakalaka Boom Boom, an Indian children's series about a boy called Sanju who has a magic pencil. Everything he drew became real. If he drew a vegetable or a policeman, the vegetable or policeman would magically appear. If he accidentally drew a snake, he could erase it and the snake would disappear. He used his pencil to help people. He even saved his parents from gangsters, and I wanted that magic pencil more than anything else in the world. At night I would pray, "God, give me Sanju's pencil. I won't tell anyone. Just leave it in my cupboard. I will use it to make everyone happy." As soon as I finished praying, I would check the drawer. The pencil was never there, but I knew who I would help first. Just along the street from our new house was an abandoned strip of land that people used as a rubbish dump. There is no rubbish collection in Swat. Quickly, it became a rubbish mountain. I didn't like walking near it as it smelt so bad. Sometimes we would spot rats running through it and crows would circle overhead. One day my brothers were not home and my mother had asked me to throw away some potato peel and eggshells. I wrinkled my nose as I approached, swatting away flies and making sure I didn't step on anything in my nice shoes. As I threw the rubbish on the mountain of rotting food, I saw something move and I jumped. It was a girl about my age. Her hair was matted and her skin was covered in sores. She looked like I imagined Shashaka, the dirty woman they told us about in tales in the village to make us wash. The girl had a big sack and was sorting rubbish into piles, one for cans, one for bottle tops, another for glass and another for paper. Nearby there were boys fishing in the pile for metal using magnets on strings. I wanted to talk to the children but I was too scared. That afternoon, when my father came home from school, I told him about the scavenger children and begged him to go with me to look. He tried to talk to them but they ran away. He explained that the children would sell what they had sorted to a garbage shop for a few rupees. The shop would then sell it on at a profit. On the way back home I noticed that he was in tears. "Abba, you must give them free places at your school," I begged. He laughed. My mother and I had already persuaded him to give free places to a number of girls. Though my mother was not educated, she was the practical one in the family, the doer, while my father was the talker. She was always out helping people. My father would get angry sometimes. He would arrive home at lunchtime and call out, "Torpekai, I'm home," only to find she was out and there was no lunch for him. Then he would find she was at the hospital visiting someone who was ill, or had gone to help a family, so he could not stay cross. Sometimes though she would be out because she was shopping for clothes in the China bazaar, and that would be a different matter. Wherever we lived my mother filled our house with people. I shared my room with my cousin Anisa from the village, who had come to live with us so she could go to school, and a girl called Shenaz whose mother Sultana had once worked in our house. Shenaz and her sister had also been sent out to collect garbage after their father had died, leaving them very poor. One of her brothers was mentally ill and was always doing strange things like setting fire to the clothes or selling the electric fan we gave them to keep cool. Sultana was very short-tempered and my mother did not like having her in the house, but my father arranged a small allowance for her and a place for Shenaz and her other brother at his school. Shenaz had never been to school, so even though she was 2 years older than me she was put 2 classes below, and she came to live with us so that I could help her. There was also Noria, whose mother Karu did some of our washing and cleaning, and Alishpa, one of the daughters of Khalida, the woman who helped my mother with the cooking. Khalida had been sold into marriage to an old man who used to beat her, and eventually she ran away with her 3 daughters. Her own family would not take her back because it is believed that a woman who has left her husband has brought shame on her family. For a while her daughters also had to collect rubbish to survive. Her story was like something out of the novels I had started reading. The school had expanded a lot by then and had 3 buildings. The original one in Landikas was a primary school, and then there was a high school for girls on Yahya Street and one for boys with a big garden of roses near the remains of the Buddhist temple. We had about 800 students in total, and although the school was not really making money, my father gave away more than 100 free places. One of them was to a boy whose father, Sharafat Ali, had helped my father when he was a penniless college student. They were friends from the village. Sharafat Ali worked at the electricity company and he would give my father a few hundred rupees whenever he could spare them. My father was happy to be able to repay his kindness. Another was a girl in my class called Kausa, whose father embroidered clothes and shawls, a trade our region is famous for. When we went on school trips to visit the mountains, I knew she couldn't afford them, so I would pay for her with my pocket money. Giving places to poor children didn't just mean my father lost the fees. Some of the richer parents took the children out of the school when they realized they were sharing classrooms with the sons and daughters of people who cleaned their houses or stitched the clothes. They thought it was shameful for the children to mix with those from poor families. My mother said it was hard for the poor children to learn when they were not getting enough food at home, so some of the girls would come to our house for breakfast. My father joked that our home had become a boarding house. Having so many people around made it hard to study. I had been delighted to have my own room, and my father had even bought me a dressing table to work on. But now I had 2 other girls in the room. I want space. I'd cry. But then I felt guilty as I knew we were lucky. I thought back to the children working on the rubbish heap. I kept seeing the dirty face of the girl from the dump and continued to pester my father to give them places at our school. He tried to explain that those children were breadwinners, so if they went to school, even for free, the whole family would go hungry. However, he got a wealthy philanthropist, Azadeh Khan, to pay for him to produce a leaflet asking, Kia Hasui Elam in Bakan Kar Hak Nahe. Is education not the right of these children? My father printed thousands of these leaflets, left them at local meetings and distributed them around town. By then my father was becoming a well-known figure in Swat. Even though he was not a Khan or a rich man, people listened to him. They knew he would have something interesting to say at workshops and seminars and wasn't afraid to criticize the authorities, even the army, which was now running our country. He was becoming known to the army too, and friends told him that the local commander had called him lethal in public. My father didn't know what exactly the brigadier meant, but in our country, where the army is so powerful, it did not bode well. One of his pet hates was the ghost schools. Influential people in remote areas took money from the government for schools which never saw a single pupil. Instead they used the buildings for their hutras or even to keep their animals. There was even a case of a man drawing a teacher's pension when he had never taught a day in his life. Aside from corruption and bad government, my father's main concern in those days was the environment. Mingora was expanding quickly, around 175,000 people now called it home, and our once fresh air was becoming very polluted from all the vehicles and cooking fires. The beautiful trees on our hills and mountains were being chopped down for timber. My father said only around half the town's population had access to safe drinking water, and most, like us, had no sanitation. So he and his friends set up something called the Global Peace Council, which, despite its name, had very local concerns. The name was ironic and my father often laughed about it, but the organization's aim was serious, to preserve the environment of SWAT and promote peace and education among local people. My father also loved to write poetry, sometimes about love but often on controversial themes such as honor killings and women's rights. Once he visited Afghanistan for a poetry festival at the Kabul Intercontinental Hotel, where he read a poem about peace. It was mentioned as the most inspiring in the closing speech, and some in the audience asked him to repeat whole stanzas and couplets, exclaiming, "Wah wah," when a particular line pleased him, which is a bit like bravo. Even my grandfather was proud. "Son, may you be the star in the sky of knowledge," he used to say. We too were proud, but his higher profile meant we didn't see him very much. It was always our mother who shopped for our clothes and took us to hospital if we were ill, even though in our culture, particularly for those of us from villages, a woman is not supposed to do these things alone. So one of my father's nephews would have to go along. When my father was at home, he and his friends Saturday on the roof at dusk and talked politics endlessly. There was really only one subject, 9/11. It might have changed the whole world, but we were living right in the epicenter of everything. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, had been living in Kandahar when the attack on the World Trade Center happened, and the Americans had sent thousands of troops to Afghanistan to catch him and overthrow the Taliban regime which had protected him. In Pakistan we were still under a dictatorship, but America needed our help, just as it had in the 1980s to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Just as the Russian invasion of Afghanistan had changed everything for General Zia, so 9/11 transformed General Musharraf from an international outcast. Suddenly he was being invited to the White House by George W. Bush and to 10 Downing Street by Tony Blair. There was a major problem, however. Our own intelligence service, ISI, had virtually created the Taliban. Many ISI officers were close to its leaders, having known them for years, and shared some of the beliefs. The ISI's Colonel Imam boasted he had trained 90,000 Taliban fighters and even became Pakistan's consul general in Herat during the Taliban regime. We were not fans of the Taliban as we had heard they destroyed girls' schools and blew up giant Buddha statues. We had many Buddhas of our own that we were proud of. But many Pashtuns did not like the bombing of Afghanistan or the way Pakistan was helping the Americans, even if it was only by allowing them to cross our airspace and stopping weapons supplies to the Taliban. We did not know then that Musharraf was also letting the Americans use our airfields. Some of our religious people saw Osama bin Laden as a hero. In the bazaar you could buy posters of him on a white horse and boxes of sweets with his picture on them. These clerics said 9/11 was revenge on the Americans for what they had been doing to other people round the world, but they ignored the fact that the people in the World Trade Center were innocent and had nothing to do with American policy, and that the Holy Quran clearly says it is wrong to kill. Our people see conspiracies behind everything, and many argued that the attack was actually carried out by Jews as an excuse for America to launch a war on the Muslim world. Some of our newspapers printed stories that no Jews went to work at the World Trade Center that day. My father said this was rubbish. Musharraf told our people that he had no choice but to cooperate with the Americans. He said they had told him, either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists, and threatened to bomb us back to the Stone Age, if we stood against them. But we weren't exactly cooperating as the ISI was still arming Taliban fighters and giving their leaders sanctuary in Quetta. They even persuaded the Americans to let them fly hundreds of Pakistani fighters out of northern Afghanistan. The ISI chief asked the Americans to hold off their attack on Afghanistan until he had gone to Kandahar to ask the Taliban leader Mullah Omar to hand over bin Laden. Instead he offered the Taliban help. In our province, Maulana Sufi Muhammad, who had fought in Afghanistan against the Russians, issued a fatwa against the US. He held a big meeting in Malakand, where our ancestors had fought the British. The Pakistani government didn't stop him. The governor of our province issued a statement that anyone who wanted to fight in Afghanistan against NATO forces was free to do so. Some 12,000 young men from SWAT went to help the Taliban. Many never came back. They were most likely killed, but as there is no proof of death, their wives can't be declared widows. It's very hard on them. My father's close friend Wahid Zaman's brother and brother-in-law were among the many who went to Afghanistan. Their wives and children are still waiting for them. I remember visiting them and feeling their longing. Even so, it all seemed far, far away from our peaceful Garden Valley. Afghanistan is less than 100 miles away, but to get there you have to go through Bajaur, one of the tribal areas between Pakistan and the border with Afghanistan. Bin Laden and his men fled to the White Mountains of Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan, where he had built a network of tunnels while fighting the Russians. They escaped through these and over the mountains into Kurram, another tribal agency. What we didn't know then was that bin Laden came to SWAT and stayed in a remote village for a year, taking advantage of the Pashtunwali hospitality code. Anyone could see that Musharraf was double-dealing, taking American money while still helping the jihadists, strategic assets, as the ISI calls them. The Americans say they gave Pakistan billions of dollars to help the campaign against al-Qaeda, but we didn't see a single cent. Musharraf built a mansion by Rawal Lake in Islamabad and bought an apartment in London. Every so often an important American official would complain that we weren't doing enough, and then suddenly some big fish would be caught. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, was found in a house just a mile from the army chief's official residence in Rawalpindi. But President Bush kept praising Musharraf, inviting him to Washington and calling him his buddy. My father and his friends were disgusted. They said the Americans always preferred dealing with dictators in Pakistan. From an early age I was interested in politics and Saturday on my father's knee listening to everything he and his friends discussed. But I was more concerned with matters closer to home, our own street to be exact. I told my friends at school about the rubbish dump children and that we should help. Not everyone wanted to, as they said the children were dirty and probably diseased, and the parents would not like them going to school with children like that. They also said it wasn't up to us to sort out the problem. I didn't agree. We can sit by and hope the government will help, but they won't. If I can help support 1 or 2 children and another family supports 1 or 2, then between us we can help them all. I knew it was pointless appealing to Musharraf. In my experience, if my father couldn't help with matters like these, there was only one option. I wrote a letter to God. Dear God, I wrote, I know you see everything, but there are so many things that maybe, sometimes, things get missed, particularly now with the bombing in Afghanistan. But I don't think you would be happy if you saw the children on my road living on a rubbish dump. God, give me strength and courage and make me perfect, because I want to make this world perfect. Malala. The problem was I did not know how to get it to him. Somehow I thought it needed to go deep into the earth, so first I buried it in the garden. Then I thought it would get spoilt, so I put it in a plastic bag. But that didn't seem much use. We like to put sacred texts in flowing waters, so I rolled it up, tied it to a piece of wood, placed a dandelion on top and floated it in the stream which flows into the Swat River. Surely God would find it there. 7. The Mufti who tried to close our school. Just in front of the school on Kushal Street, where I was born, was the house of a tall handsome mullah and his family. His name was Gula Mullah and he called himself a Mufti, which means he is an Islamic scholar and authority on Islamic law, though my father complains that anyone with a turban can call themselves a Maulana or Mufti. The school was doing well, and my father was building an impressive reception with an arched entrance in the boys' high school. For the first time my mother could buy nice clothes and even send out for food as she had dreamed of doing back in the village. But all this time the Mufti was watching. He watched the girls going in and out of our school every day and became angry, particularly as some of the girls were teenagers. "That MALALA has a bad eye on us," said my father one day. He was right. Shortly afterwards the Mufti went to the woman who owned the school premises and said, "LIbAN is running a harem school in your building and bringing shame on the Mohalla neighborhood. These girls should be in purdah." He told her, "Take this building back from him and I will rent it for my madrasa. If you do this you will get paid now and also receive a reward in the next world." She refused and her son came to my father in secret. "This MALALA is starting a campaign against you," he warned. "We won't give him the building but be careful." My father was angry. Just as we say, "Nim hakim katrai jan," half a doctor is a danger to one's life, so, "Nim mullah katrai aman," a mullah who is not fully learned is a danger to faith, he said. I am proud that our country was created as the world's first Muslim homeland, but we still don't agree on what this means. The Quran teaches us sabr, patience, but often it feels that we have forgotten the word and think Islam means women sitting at home in purdah or wearing burqas while men do jihad. We have many strands of Islam in Pakistan. Our founder Jinnah wanted the rights of Muslims in India to be recognized, but the majority of people in India were Hindu. It was as if there was a feud between two brothers and they agreed to live in different houses. So British India was divided in August 1947, and an independent Muslim state was born. It could hardly have been a bloodier beginning. Millions of Muslims crossed from India, and Hindus traveled in the other direction. Almost 2 million of them were killed trying to cross the new border. Many were slaughtered on trains which arrived at Lahore and Delhi full of bloodied corpses. My own grandfather narrowly escaped death in the riots when his train was attacked by Hindus on his way home from Delhi, where he had been studying. Now we are a country of 180 million and more than 96% are Muslim. We also have around 2 million Christians and more than 2 million Ahmadis, who say they are Muslims though our government says they are not. Sadly those minority communities are often attacked. Jinnah had lived in London as a young man and trained as a barrister. He wanted a land of tolerance. Our people often quote the famous speech he made a few days before independence. "You are free to go to your temples. You are free to go to your mosques or to any other place of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed, that has nothing to do with the business of the state." My father says the problem is that Jinnah negotiated a piece of real estate for us but not a state. He died of tuberculosis just a year after the creation of Pakistan and we haven't stopped fighting since. We have had 3 wars against India and what seems like endless killing inside our own country. We Muslims are split between Sunnis and Shias, we share the same fundamental beliefs and the same Holy Quran but we disagree over who was the right person to lead our religion when the Prophet died in the 7th century. The man chosen to be the leader or caliph was Abu Bakr, a close friend and advisor of the Prophet and the man he chose to lead prayers as he lay on his deathbed. Sunni comes from the Arabic for one who follows the traditions of the Prophet. But a smaller group believed that leadership should have stayed within the Prophet's family and that Ali, his son-in-law and cousin, should have taken over. They became known as Shias, shortened from Shi'at-e-Ali, the party of Ali. Every year Shias commemorate the killing of the Prophet's grandson Hussein ibn Ali at the Battle of Karbala in the year 680 with a festival called Muharram. They whip themselves into a bloody frenzy with metal chains or razor blades on strings until the streets run red. One of my father's friends is a Shia and he cries whenever he talks about Hussein's death at Karbala. He gets so emotional you would think the events had happened just the night before, not more than 1,300 years ago. Our own founder, Jinnah, was a Shia, and Benazir Bhutto's mother was also a Shia from Iran. Most Pakistanis are Sunnis like us, more than 80%, but within that we are again many groups. By far the biggest group is the Barelvis, who are named after a 19th century madrasa in Bareilly, which lies in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. Then we have the Deobandi, named after another famous 19th century madrasa in Uttar Pradesh, this time in the village of Deoband. They are very conservative and most of our madrasas are Deobandi. We also have the Ahle Hadith, people of the Hadith, who are Salafists. This group is more Arab-influenced and even more conservative than the others. They are what the West calls fundamentalists. They don't accept our saints and shrines. Many Pakistanis are also mystical people and gather at Sufi shrines to dance and worship. Each of these strands has many different subgroups. The Mufti on Kushal Street was a member of Tablighi Jama'ah, a Deobandi group that holds a huge rally every year at its headquarters in Raiwind, near Lahore, attended by millions of people. Our last dictator General Zia used to go there, and in the 1980s, under his regime, the Tablighis became very powerful. Many of the imams appointed to preach in army barracks were Tablighis, and army officers would often take leave and go on preaching tours for the group. One night, after the Mufti had failed to persuade our landlady to cancel our lease, he gathered some of the influential people and elders of our Mahola into a delegation and turned up at our door. There were 7 people, some other senior Tablighis, a mosque keeper, a former jihadi and a shopkeeper. And they filled our small house. My father seemed worried and shooed us into the other room, but the house was small so we could hear every word. I am representing the ulama and Tablighian and Taliban, Mullah Ghulamullah said, referring to not just one but 2 organizations of Muslim scholars to give himself gravitas. I am representing good Muslims and we all think your girls' school is haram and a blasphemy. You should close it. Girls should not be going to school, he continued. A girl is so sacred she should be in purdah, and so private that there is no lady's name in the Quran as God doesn't want her to be named. My father could listen no more. Maryam is mentioned everywhere in the Quran. Was she not a woman and a good woman at that? No, said the mullah. She is only there to prove that Isa, Jesus, was the son of Maryam, not the son of God. That may be, replied my father. But I am pointing out that the Quran names Maryam. The Mufti started to object but my father had had enough. Turning to the group, he said, when this gentleman passes me on the street, I look to him and greet him but he doesn't answer, he just bows his head. The mullah looked down embarrassed because greeting someone properly is important in Islam. You run the haram school, he said. That's why I don't want to greet you. Then one of the other men spoke up. I'd heard you were an infidel, he said to my father, but there are Qurans in your room. Of course there are, replied my father, astonished that his faith would be questioned. I am a Muslim. Let's get back to the subject of the school, said the Mufti, who could see the discussion was not going his way. There are men in the reception area of the school, and they see the girls enter, and this is very bad. I have a solution, said my father. The school has another gate. The girls will enter through that. The mullah clearly wasn't happy as he wanted the school closed altogether. But the elders were happy with this compromise and they left. My father suspected this would not be the end of the matter. What we knew and they didn't was that the Mufti's own niece attended the school in secret. So a few days later my father called the Mufti's elder brother, the girl's father. I am very tired of your brother, he said. What kind of mullah is he? He's driving us crazy. Can you help to get him off our backs? I'm afraid I can't help you, Zierden, he replied. I have trouble in my home too. He lives with us and has told his wife that she must observe purdah from us and that our wives must observe purdah from him, all in this small space. Our wives are like sisters to him and his is like a sister to us, but this madman has made our house a hell. I am sorry but I can't help you. My father was right to think this man was not going to give up. Mullahs had become more powerful figures since Zia's rule and campaign of Islamization. In some ways General Musharraf was very different from General Zia. Though he usually dressed in uniform, he occasionally wore Western suits and he called himself Chief Executive instead of Chief Martial Law Administrator. He also kept dogs, which we Muslims regard as unclean. Instead of Islamization, he began what he called enlightened moderation. He opened up our media, allowing new private TV channels and female newsreaders, as well as showing dancing on television. The celebration of Western holidays such as Valentine's Day and New Year's Eve was allowed. He even sanctioned an annual pop concert on the eve of Independence Day, which was broadcast to the nation. He did something which our democratic rulers hadn't, even Benazir, and abolished the law that for a woman to prove she was raped, she had to produce 4 male witnesses. He appointed the first woman governor of the state bank and the first women airline pilots and coast guards. He even announced we would have female guards at Jinnah's tomb in Karachi. However, in our Pashtun homeland of the northwest frontier province things were very different. In 2002 Musharraf held elections for controlled democracy. They were strange elections as the main party leaders Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto were in exile. In our province these elections brought what we called a mullah government to power. The Muttahida Majlis-e Amal (MMA) alliance was a group of 5 religious parties including the Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam, ZUI, which ran the madrasas where the Taliban were trained. People jokingly referred to the MMA as the Mullah Military Alliance and said they got elected because they had Musharraf's support. But some people supported him because the very religious Pashtuns were angry at the American invasion of Afghanistan and the removal of the Taliban from power there. Our area had always been more conservative than most of the rest of Pakistan. During the Afghan jihad many madrasas had been built, most of them funded by Saudi money, and many young men had passed through them as it was free education. That was the start of what my father calls the Arabization of Pakistan. Then 9/11 had made this militancy more mainstream. Sometimes when I walked along the main road I saw chalked messages on the sides of buildings. Contact US for jihad training, they would say, listing a phone number to call. In those days jihadi groups were free to do whatever they wanted. You could see them openly collecting contributions and recruiting men. There was even a headmaster from Shangla who would boast that his greatest success was to send 10 boys in grade 9 for jihad training in Kashmir. The MMA government banned CD and DVD shops and wanted to create a morality police like the Afghan Taliban had set up. The idea was they would be able to stop a woman accompanied by a man and require her to prove that the man was her relative. Thankfully, our Supreme Court stopped this. Then MMA activists launched attacks on cinemas and tore down billboards with pictures of women or blacked them out with paint. They even snatched female mannequins from clothing shops. They harassed men wearing Western-style shirts and trousers instead of the traditional shalwar kameez and insisted women cover their heads. It was as though they wanted to remove all traces of womankind from public life. My father's high school opened in 2003. That first year they had boys and girls together, but by 2004 the climate had changed so it was unthinkable to have girls and boys in the same class. That changing climate made Gulamullah bold. One of the school clerks told my father that the Mufti kept coming into school and demanding why we girls were still using the main entrance. He said that one day, when a male member of staff took a female teacher out to the main road to get a rickshaw, the Maulana asked, why did this man escort her to the road, is he her brother? No, replied the clerk, he is a colleague. That is wrong, said the Maulana. My father told the clerk to call him next time he saw the Maulana. When the call came, my father and the Islamic studies teacher went out to confront him. Maulana, you have driven me to the wall. My father said, who are you? You are crazy. You need to go to a doctor. You think I enter the school and take my clothes off. When you see a boy and a girl you see a scandal. They are school children. I think you should go and see Dr. Haider Ali. Dr. Hyder Ali was a well-known psychiatrist in our area, so to say, "Shall we take you to Dr. Hyder Ali?" meant, "Are you mad?" The Mufti went quiet. He took off his turban and put it in my father's lap. For us, a turban is a public symbol of chivalry and Pashtuns, and for a man to lose his turban is considered a great humiliation. But then he started up again. "I never said those things to your clerk. He is lying." My father had had enough. "You have no business here," he shouted. "Go away." The Mufti had failed to close our school, but his interference was an indication of how our country was changing. My father was worried. He and his fellow activists were holding endless meetings. These were no longer just about stopping people cutting down trees, but were also about education and democracy. In 2004, after resisting pressure from Washington for more than 2.5 years, General Musharraf sent the army into the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, 7 agencies that lie along the border with Afghanistan, where the government had little control. The Americans claimed that al-Qaeda militants who had fled from Afghanistan during the U.S. bombing were using the areas as a safe haven, taking advantage of our Pashtun hospitality. From there they were running training camps and launching raids across the border on NATO troops. For us in SWAT this was very close to home. One of the agencies, Bajaur, is next to SWAT. The people who live in the FATA are all from Pashtun tribes like us Yusufzai, and live on both sides of the border with Afghanistan. The tribal agencies were created in British times as a buffer zone between Afghanistan and what was then India, and they are still run in the same way, administered by tribal chiefs or elders known as Maliks. Unfortunately, the Maliks make little difference. In truth, the tribal areas are not governed at all. They are forgotten places of harsh rocky valleys where people scrape by on smuggling. The average annual income is just $250, half the Pakistani average. They have very few hospitals and schools, particularly for girls, and political parties were not allowed there until recently. Hardly any women from these areas can read. The people are renowned for the fierceness and independence, as you can see if you read any of the old British accounts. Our army had never before gone into the FATA. Instead they had maintained indirect control in the same way the British had, relying on the Pashtun recruited frontier corps rather than regular soldiers. Sending in the regular army was a tough decision. Not only did our army and ISI have long links with some of the militants, but it also meant our troops would be fighting their own Pashtun brothers. The first tribal area that the army entered was South Waziristan, in March 2004. Predictably, the local people saw it as an attack on their way of life. All the men there carry weapons and hundreds of soldiers were killed when the locals revolted. The army was in shock. Some men refused to fight, not wishing to battle their own people. They retreated after just 12 days and reached what they called a negotiated peace settlement with local militant leaders like Nek Mohammed. This involved the army bribing them to halt all attacks and keep out foreign fighters. The militants simply used the cash to buy more weapons and resumed their activities. A few months later came the first attack on Pakistan by a U.S. drone. On the 17th of June 2004, an unmanned Predator dropped a Hellfire missile on Nek Mohammed in South Waziristan, apparently while he was giving an interview by satellite phone. He and the men around him were killed instantly. Local people had no idea what it was. Back then we did not know that the Americans could do such a thing. Whatever you thought about Nek Mohammed, we were not at war with the Americans and were shocked that they would launch attacks from the sky on our soil. Across the tribal areas people were angry and many joined militant groups or formed lashkars, local militias. Then there were more attacks. The Americans said that bin Laden's deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri was hiding in Bajaur and had taken a wife there. In January 2006, a drone supposedly targeting him landed on a village called Damadola, destroying 3 houses and killing 18 people. The Americans said he had been tipped off and escaped. That same year, on the 30th of October, another U.S. Predator hit a madrasa on a hill near the main town of Kar, killing 82 people, many of them young boys. The Americans said it was the Al-Qaeda training camp which had featured in the group's videos and that the hill was riddled with tunnels and gun emplacements. Within a few hours of the attack, an influential local cleric called Fakir Muhammad, who had run the madrasa, announced that the deaths would be avenged by suicide bombings against Pakistani soldiers. My father and his friends were worried and called together local elders and leaders for a peace conference. It was a bitterly cold night in January, but 150 people gathered. "It's coming here," my father warned. "The fire is reaching the valley. Let's put out the flames of militancy before they reach here." But no one would listen. Some people even laughed, including a local political leader sitting in the front row. "Mr. Khan," my father said to him, "you know what happened to the people of Afghanistan. They are now refugees and they're living with us. The same is happening with Bajor. The same will happen to us, mark my words, and we will have no shelter, no place to migrate to." But the expression on the man's face was mocking. "Look at this man," he seemed to be saying of my father. "I am a Khan. Who would dare kick me out of this area?" My father came home frustrated. "I have a school, but I am neither a Khan nor a political leader. I have no platform," he said. "I am only one small man." 8. The autumn of the earthquake. One fine October day when I was still in primary school, our desks started to tremble and shake. Our classes were still mixed at that age, and all the boys and girls yelled, "Earthquake." We ran outside as we had been taught to do. All the children gathered around our teachers as chicks swarmed to a mother hen. Swat lies on a geological fault line and we often had earthquakes, but this felt different. All the buildings around us seemed to be shaking and the rumbling didn't stop. Most of us were crying and our teachers were praying. Miss Ruby, one of my favorite teachers, told us to stop crying and to stay calm, it would soon be over. Once the shaking had stopped, we were all sent home. We found our mother sitting in a chair holding the Quran, reciting verses over and over. Whenever there is trouble, people pray a lot. She was relieved to see us and hugged us, tears streaming down her face. But the aftershocks kept coming all afternoon, so we remained very scared. We had moved again. We would move 7 times by the time I was 13, and were living in an apartment building. It was high for Mingora, 2 stories with a big water tank on the roof. My mother was terrified it would collapse on top of us, so we kept going outside. My father did not get home till late that evening as he had been busy checking all the other school buildings. When nightfall came, there were still tremors and my mother was in a state of panic. Every time we felt a tremor, we thought it was the day of judgment. "We will be buried in our beds," she cried. She insisted we leave, but my father was exhausted and we Muslims believe our fate is written by God. So he put me and my brothers Kushal and Atul, then just a baby, to bed. "Go wherever you want," he told my mother and cousin. "I am staying here. If you believe in God, you will stay here. I think when there is a great disaster or our lives are in danger, we remember our sins and wonder how we will meet God and whether we will be forgiven. But God has also given us the power to forget, so that when the tragedy is over we carry on as normal." I trusted in my father's faith, but I also shared my mother's very real concerns. That earthquake of the 8th of October 2005 turned out to be one of the worst in history. It was 7.6 on the Richter scale and was felt as far away as Kabul and Delhi. Our town of Mingora was largely spared. Just a few buildings collapsed, but neighboring Kashmir and the northern areas of Pakistan were devastated. Even in Islamabad, buildings collapsed. It took a while for us to realize how bad it was. When the TV news began to show the devastation, we saw that entire villages had been turned to dust. Landslides blocked access to the worst affected parts and all the phones and power lines were down. The earthquake had affected 30,000 square kilometers, an area as big as the American state of Connecticut. The numbers were unbelievable. More than 73,000 people had been killed and 128,000 injured, many of them permanently disabled. Around 3.5 million people had lost their homes. Roads, bridges, water and power had all gone. Places we had visited like Balico were almost completely destroyed. Many of those killed were children who, like me, had been at school that morning. Some 6,400 schools were turned to rubble and 18,000 children lost their lives. We remembered how scared we had been that morning and started raising money at school. Everyone brought what they could. My father went to everybody he knew, asking for donations of food, clothing and money, and I helped my mother collect blankets. My father raised money from the SWAT Association of Private Schools and the Global Peace Council to add to what we had collected at school. The total came to more than 1 million rupees. A publishing company in Lahore which supplied our schoolbooks sent 5 trucks of food and other essentials. We were terribly worried about our family in Shangla, jammed between those narrow mountains. Finally we got news from a cousin. In my father's small village 8 people had been killed and many homes destroyed. One of them was the house of the local cleric, MALALA Kadam, which fell down crushing his 4 beautiful daughters. I wanted to go to Shangla with my father and the trucks, but he told me it would be too dangerous. When he returned a few days later he was ashen. He told us that the last part of the journey had been very difficult. Much of the road had collapsed into the river and large boulders had fallen and blocked the way. Our family and friends said they had thought it was the end of the world. They described the roar of rocks sliding down hills and everyone running out of their houses reciting the Quran, the screams as roofs crashed down and the howls of the buffaloes and goats. As the tremors continued they had spent the entire day outdoors and then the night too, huddling together for warmth, even though it was bitterly cold in the mountains. To start with, the only rescue workers who came were a few from a locally based foreign aid agency and volunteers from the Tehreek Nafaz-e-Sharia-e-Muhammadi, TNSM, or Movement for the Enforcement of Islamic Law, the group founded by Sufi Muhammad that had sent men to fight in Afghanistan. Sufi Muhammad had been in jail since 2002 when Musharraf arrested a number of militant leaders after American pressure, but his organization still continued and was being run by his son-in-law Maulana Fazlullah. It was hard for the authorities to reach places like Shangla because most of the roads and bridges had gone and local government had been wiped out throughout the region. We saw an official from the United Nations say on television that it was the worst logistical nightmare that the UN had ever faced. General Musharraf called it a test of the nation, and announced that the army had set up Operation Lifeline. Our army likes giving their operations names. There were lots of pictures on the news of army helicopters laden with supplies and tents, but in many of the small valleys the helicopters could not land and the aid packages they dropped off and rolled down slopes into rivers. In some places, when the helicopters flew in, the locals all rushed underneath them, which meant they could not drop supplies safely. But some aid did get in. The Americans were quick as they had thousands of troops and hundreds of helicopters in Afghanistan, so could easily fly in supplies and show they were helping us in our hour of need, though some crews covered the American markings on their helicopters, fearing attack. For many in the remote areas it was the first time they had seen a foreigner. Most of the volunteers came from Islamic charities or organizations, but some of these were fronts for militant groups. The most visible of all was Jama'at al-Dawa, JUD, the welfare wing of Lashkar-e-Taiba. LET had close links to the ISI and was set up to liberate Kashmir, which we believe should be part of Pakistan, not India, as its population is mostly Muslim. The leader of LET is a fiery professor from Lahore called Hafiz Saeed, who is often on television calling on people to attack India. When the earthquake happened and our government did little to help, JUD set up relief camps patrolled by men with Kalashnikovs and walkie-talkies. Everyone knew these men belonged to LET, and soon the black and white banners with crossed swords were flying everywhere in the mountains and valleys. In the town of Muzaffarabad in Azad Kashmir, the Jud even set up a large field hospital with X-ray machines, an operating theatre, a well-stocked pharmacy and a dental department. Doctors and surgeons offered their services along with thousands of young volunteers. Earthquake victims praised the activists who had trudged up and down mountains and through shattered valleys carrying medical help to remote regions no one else had bothered with. They helped clear and rebuild destroyed villages as well as leading prayers and burying bodies. Even today, when most of the foreign aid agencies have gone, shattered buildings still line the roadside and people are still waiting for compensation from the government to build new houses. The Jud banners and helpers are still present. My cousin who was studying in the UK said they raised lots of money from Pakistanis living there. People later said that some of this money had been diverted to finance a plot to bomb planes traveling from Britain to the US. With such a large number of people killed, there were many children orphaned, 11,000 of them. In our culture, orphans are usually taken in by the extended family, but the earthquake was so bad that entire families had been wiped out or lost everything, so were in no position to take in children. The government promised they would all be looked after by the state, but that felt as empty as most government promises. My father heard that many of the boys were taken in by the Jud and housed in their madrasas. In Pakistan, madrasas are a kind of welfare system as they give free food and lodging, but the teaching does not follow a normal curriculum. The boys learn the Quran by heart, rocking back and forth as they recite. They learn that there is no such thing as science or literature, that dinosaurs never existed and that man never went to the moon. The whole nation was in shock for a long time after the earthquake. Already so unlucky with our politicians and military dictators, now, on top of everything else, we had to deal with a natural disaster. Mullahs from the TNSM preached that the earthquake was a warning from God. If we did not mend our ways and introduce Shariat or Islamic law, they shouted in their thundering voices, more severe punishment would come.